All right, so today we're taking a deep dive into OpenAI's code interpreter, but before we even think about opening the official documentation, we're going to build a roadmap to navigate it.
Exactly. Think of this as like a cheat sheet for understanding like all the core concepts of code interpreter before you go into like the technical like nitty-gritty of the documentation. Especially helpful since you're just starting out with Python.
Right, we know you have about 3 months of Python experience.
Yeah.
So let's start with the basics. What exactly is code interpreter?
It's basically a tool within OpenAI assistants that lets you write and run Python code.
Okay.
The cool part is it's like a safe, contained environment so you can experiment without worrying about breaking anything.
Okay, so it's like a sandbox for Python code.
Yeah.
But what makes it so special? I can already run Python code on my computer.
It's way more than just like a place to run code. It can process files, generate files, create visuals like graphs, even solve math problems for you.
Wait, solve math problems so I could like upload a spreadsheet and have it do calculations for me.
Absolutely, and that's just scratching the surface. The really cool part is that it can iteratively solve problems.
Okay.
So if your code isn't working, it'll try different approaches until it finds a solution that works.
So it's almost like having a coding partner who can help debug and troubleshoot. I'm already seeing how this could be really helpful for a beginner.
It's a game changer, especially for folks who are still getting comfortable with Python.
No, I'm guessing all this awesome functionality comes with a price tag.
It does, but it's pretty reasonable. Code interpreter costs $0.03 per session, with each session lasting for an hour.
So if I'm working on a project for a few hours, that's multiple sessions.
Correct. Each hour of continuous activity counts as a separate session.
Got it. Now, how do I actually activate this code interpreter thing?
It's surprisingly simple. You just include the code interpreter parameter when you're creating an assistant object using Python code.
Okay.
Think of it like adding a special tool to your coding toolbox.
Once it's activated, does it just magically know when to jump in and start solving problems?
Well, the model is pretty smart about figuring out when to use code interpreter, but you can always guide it by giving clear instructions in your prompts.
Right.
Like, write code to calculate the average of this data.
So it's a collaboration, not just a set it and forget it kind of thing.
Exactly. You're still in control, but you have this powerful tool at your disposal.
Speaking of control, how does code interpreter handle files? I know a lot of coding involves working with data from different sources.
That's a great question. Working with files in Code Interpreter happens at 2 levels. The assistant level and the thread level files you pass at the assistant level are accessible to all the different runs within that assistant.
Okay.
It's kind of like having a shared workspace for your entire project.
So if I'm working on a project with multiple parts,
Right.
all those parts can access the same set of files. It's pretty handy.
Precisely on the other hand, files passed at the thread level are more specific and only accessible within that particular thread. Think of it like having separate folders for different subtasks within your project.
All right, that makes sense. So it's all about organization and keeping things tidy.
Yeah.
But how do I actually get these files into Code Interpreter? Do I just drag and drop them in?
Not quite, although it would be nice if it were that simple.
Right.
You use the file upload endpoint to upload your file.
Okay.
Then when you're creating a message in your code, you use the file ID, which is like a unique identifier to tell Code Interpreter which file you're referring to.
Okay, starting to sound a bit technical here, but I'm following along.
Yeah.
Are there any limits on the types or sizes of files I can upload?
There is a file size limit of 512 MB.
Okay.
But the range of supported file formats is pretty impressive. You can work with everything from simple text files and spreadsheets to PDFs, images, and even compressed archives.
So no matter what kind of data I'm working with, Code Interpreter probably has a way to handle it that's reassuring.
Exactly. Now let's talk about the outputs. Code Interpreter can generate output files, just like it can process input files.
Okay.
You can get images, CSV files, PDFs, and more.
Hold on. So it can actually create things based on the code it runs.
Yep, it's pretty powerful. There are 2 main types of output files, images and data files.
Okay.
For images, you'll find the file ID in the assistant message response,
Okay.
and you can use that to download the image.
Okay, so it's like a treasure map leading to my image. What about data files?
Data files are a little different. Code Interpreter will usually reference a file path in its response.
Okay.
You'll see something like download this CSV file, and that file path acts as a downloadable link.
Okay, so it's all about following the breadcrumbs. This is making a lot more sense now. But what if I want to understand what's happening behind the scenes? Can I see how Code Interpreter is actually processing my requests?
You absolutely can. OpenAI believes in transparency, so you can access the input and output logs of Code Interpreter,
Okay.
which show you the code that was sent and the results that were generated.
That sounds incredibly helpful, especially when I'm trying to figure out why something isn't working as expected. How do I access these logs?
You can use a Python function called client.beta.threads.runs.steps.list, but we'll get into the details of that a bit later.
Okay, so I can peek behind the curtain if needed.
Yeah.
Now, before we dive into the nitty-gritty of supported file formats, why is it so important to understand how Code Interpreter works before diving into the documentation? It seems like we've already covered a lot of ground.
We have, and that's the point. Think of this deep dive as building a mental model of how Code Interpreter works.
Right.
Once you have this framework in place, navigating the documentation becomes much easier.
Yeah.
You'll recognize terms, understand the concepts, and be able to find the information you need.
All right, I'm starting to see the value in this approach. It's like having a map of the terrain before you set off on a hike.
Exactly.
So are we ready to explore that map of file formats now?
Yes, let's move on to the specific file types that Code Interpreter can handle. This is where things get really interesting because the possibilities are vast.
Okay, I'm ready for the grand tour. Hit me with the list.
All right, so we're talking about file types. Code Interpreter can handle a really wide range of them, from simple text files to like those you probably use every day, like spreadsheets and images.
Hey, so let's break it down. What are some examples of those text files it can work with?
Well, think about the code you write Python uses, like .py extensions. Code Interpreter can handle that, of course, but also other programming languages like C, C++A, Java, even files for web pages.
So if I wanted to feed it some HTML to analyze or maybe a chunk of JavaScript, it could work with that.
Absolutely. It also supports things like JSON for data markdown files and plain text files, the basic stuff.
Got it. That's a pretty solid range for text files.
Yeah.
What about those other types you mentioned, like spreadsheets and things?
Those fall under application files. Think about the Microsoft Office Suite Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, Excel spreadsheets. Code Interpreter can work with all those. It can even process PDFs, which is incredibly useful.
Okay, so I could potentially analyze data from a spreadsheet or extract information from a PDF, all within Code Interpreter. That opens up some interesting possibilities.
Exactly. And don't forget images, JPEGs, PNGs, GIFs. Those are all supported too, so you can bring in visual data as well.
This is starting to feel like a one-stop shop for data processing.
It really is. It's designed to be versatile and handle a variety of tasks. And on top of the common file types we've talked about, it can even work with more specialized formats like Python, pickle files, compressed archives, and even XML for markup languages.
Wow, the list just keeps growing. So it's pretty safe to say that no matter what kind of data I'm working with, Code Interpreter can probably handle it, right?
You're catching on quickly. And the best part is that the OpenAI documentation has a detailed list of all these file formats and their MIME types, which is a standardized way of identifying the file format. Think of it like a decoder ring for understanding file compatibility.
So it's like a cheat sheet for making sure my data will play nicely with Code Interpreter.
Exactly. It's there to make your life easier.
All right, so we've talked about what Code Interpreter is, how to activate it, how it handles files, how to understand the output. It feels like we've covered almost everything what's left to explore.
We've covered a lot, but there's one crucial piece of the puzzle we haven't delved into yet, the concept of runs.
Runs, what are those?
Think of a run as a single execution of code within Code Interpreter. It's like a mini program within the larger Code Interpreter environment.
Okay, so if I upload a Python script and tell Code Interpreter to run it, that would be considered one run.
You got it.
And what if my script has multiple functions or sections? Does each of those count as a separate run?
No. A single run encompasses the execution of your entire script, regardless of how many functions or sections it has. It's like hitting the play button on your code and letting it run from start to finish.
So a run is essentially a complete execution cycle of my code within Code Interpreter.
Exactly. And this concept is important because it helps us understand how Code Interpreter processes your requests and generates outputs. It's also essential for accessing the input and output logs we talked about earlier.
Okay, I'm starting to see how this all fits together. But if a run represents the entire execution of my code, how can I see the individual steps or the output of specific functions within that run?
That's where the concept of steps comes in within each run. There can be multiple steps. Think of steps as the individual actions or operations that Code Interpreter performs as it executes your code.
So if my code has a function to read a file, process the data, and then create a graph, each of those actions would be a separate step within the overall run.
Precisely. And by examining these individual steps, you can gain a deeper understanding of how Code Interpreter is processing your code and pinpoint any potential errors or issues.
That makes sense. It's like breaking down a complex task into smaller, more manageable chunks. So how do I access these steps?
Remember that Python function I mentioned earlier, client.beta.threads.runs.steps.list?
Yeah, the one that sounded a bit technical.
Well, that's the key to unlocking the steps within a run. By using this function and providing the thread ID and run ID, you can retrieve a detailed list of all the steps that Code Interpreter took.
Okay, so it's like providing the right credentials to access a secret vault of information.
Exactly. And this information is incredibly valuable for debugging, understanding how your code is being processed, and optimizing your interactions with Code Interpreter.
All right, I'm starting to see the bigger picture here. We have runs, which represent the complete execution of our code. And within each run, we have steps that show us the individual actions taken by Code Interpreter. And we can access these steps using that special Python function. It's like peeling back the layers of an onion to reveal the inner workings.
That's a great analogy. And the best part is that once you understand these core concepts, run steps, and the function to access them, the OpenAI documentation will become much easier to navigate and comprehend.
So it's all about building a mental model of how everything works before diving into the technical details.
Exactly. And now that we have that model in place, we're ready to tackle the documentation with confidence. But before we do that, let's take a moment to recap what we've learned so far and why it's so important.
Great idea. Yeah. So we've covered a lot of ground, but the key takeaway is that Code Interpreter is more than just a code runner. It's a powerful tool that can process files, generate outputs, and even solve problems iteratively.
Right. And we've learned how to activate it, work with files, understand the outputs, and even peek behind the scenes to see how it's processing our requests. We've also explored the concepts of runs and steps, which are essential for understanding how Code Interpreter operates and accessing valuable information for debugging and optimization.
And the best part is that all of this knowledge will make navigating the OpenAI documentation much smoother and less daunting.
Exactly. We've built a solid foundation of understanding, and now we're ready to explore the documentation with confidence and clarity.
All right, I'm feeling a lot more prepared now, so we're ready to open those docs and see what other treasures we can uncover.
Let's do it.
All right, so we've built this mental map of Code Interpreter. We know how to activate it, feed it files, understand its outputs, even peek into those runs and steps to see what's happening under the hood. It's like we've assembled the toolkit before starting the project.
Exactly. And with those tools in hand, the OpenAI documentation becomes less of a dense forest and more like a well-marked trail. You'll start to see how the pieces connect, how the terminology relates to what we've discussed.
That's a great way to put it.
Yep.
So now that we're ready to tackle those docs, what are some key things we should be looking for to deepen our understanding?
I think one of the most interesting aspects of Code Interpreter, and this is where the documentation gets really insightful, is its ability to understand the intent behind your code, not just blindly execute it.
Wait, so it's not just a glorified Python interpreter, it's actually trying to figure out what I'm trying to do.
Exactly, and that makes a huge difference, especially for beginners. Let's say you write some code that's not quite optimal. Maybe there's a more efficient way to do it. Code Interpreter might actually tweak your code or suggest alternative approaches to achieve the desired outcome.
So it's like having a coding mentor built into the system, someone who can guide me towards better practices, even if my code isn't perfect.
That's a great way to think about it. It takes some of the pressure off having to write flawless code from the get-go. You can focus on the logic and problem solving, and Code Interpreter will help you refine the execution.
That's a huge confidence booster for someone who's still learning now. If we zoom out a bit, where do you see tools like Code Interpreter fitting into the future of coding as a whole?
It's fascinating to consider we're already seeing a shift towards making coding more accessible, less intimidating for people who don't have years of experience. Tools like this break down those barriers, allowing anyone with curiosity and a willingness to learn to start creating with code.
So it's almost like democratizing coding, making it a more inclusive field.
I think that's a great way to put it. And as these tools continue to evolve, I believe we'll see them integrated into even more aspects of our lives. Imagine being able to easily automate tasks, analyze data, or even build simple applications without needing to be a coding expert.
It's exciting to think about the possibilities, and it sounds like Code Interpreter is at the forefront of this movement. So as we wrap up our deep dive today, what's the one key message you want to leave our listener with?
I want them to walk away with a sense of empowerment and excitement. Don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, and learn along the way. Code Interpreter is a fantastic tool for exploration and discovery, and who knows, maybe you'll be the one to create the next groundbreaking application or solve a complex problem using its power.
I love that message. It's all about embracing the learning journey and seeing where it leads. Well, folks, that's a wrap on our deep dive into OpenAI's Code Interpreter. We hope you're leaving today feeling informed, inspired, and ready to start coding. And remember, those OpenAI docs aren't as scary as they seem, especially with the mental map we've built together. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible. All right, Python adventurers, welcome to your own personal deep dive, into OpenAI.
Yeah.
We know you're about 3 months into your Python journey. You're ready to tackle those OpenAI docs.
Yeah.
But, sometimes those docs can feel like a maze, right?
Oh, definitely. It's a lot to take in, especially when you're just getting comfortable with Python itself and all the syntax and everything like that. So that's why we're going to break it down together piece by piece and hopefully build a little roadmap before you even open up those docs.
Exactly. We're going to be your guides, and we're going to help you understand everything without getting lost in the jargon.
Yeah.
So first things first, what are these assistants that the OpenAI docs keep mentioning?
Assistant.
They sound pretty powerful.
Yeah. So assistants are basically like, you can think of them as supercharged chatbots.
Yeah.
But instead of just responding to your questions, they can actually perform actions. So it's like, imagine you have this incredibly helpful digital assistant that can understand your requests and then actually do things like book appointments, write emails, or even generate code for you.
Wow, that's a game changer.
Yeah.
It goes way beyond just simple Q&A. Like those basic chatbots we're used to.
Right.
So how do we make these assistants do our bidding?
Mm.
Is it like giving them a set of instructions?
You're in the right track. It's all about what we call function calling. And that is essentially giving your assistant a toolbox filled with special tools, and each tool represents a specific action that it can perform.
Okay.
So you tell the assistant which tool to use, and it gets to work.
All right, that makes sense. So instead of just chatting, we're actually giving the assistant the power to do things for us.
Exactly.
The docs use a weather assistant as an example.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through that a little bit?
Absolutely. So the weather assistant is a really great example to understand how this function calling works in practice.
Okay.
Imagine you ask the assistant, what's the weather like in London right now?
Mm-hmm.
To answer your question, the assistant needs to actually go out and access specific information like the temperature and the chance of rain, right?
Okay, that makes sense. So
Yep.
how does it get that information?
That's where these functions come in.
Right.
So the documentation provides two example functions called getCurrentTemperature and getRainProbability. And these functions are like the tools in our toolbox.
Okay.
Each function is designed to fetch a specific piece of data.
Got it. So get current temperature would grab the temperature for a specific location, and get rain probability would calculate the chances of rain.
Exactly.
Do the functions need any specific info to work?
Yes, they do, just like a real tool needs the right inputs to work.
Okay.
These functions need parameters. So, for example, getCurrentTemperature needs to know the location and what units to use, so Celsius or Fahrenheit.
Okay, that makes sense. So when we ask about the weather in London, the assistant knows to use those functions and figures out what information they need.
Right.
But how does the whole conversation flow between us and the assistant? It seems like there's a lot going on behind the scenes.
There is a lot going on behind the scenes. OpenAI has a specific structure for how these interactions work, and you can think of it like texting. So when you want to text a new friend, you start a new thread.
Okay.
And within that thread, you exchange individual messages with the assistant, just like you would with a friend.
Okay, so each question I ask and each response the assistant gives is a message
Yes.
within a thread. Okay,
Mhm.
got it. But what about this term run that I keep seeing in the documentation? Where does that fit in?
So a run is basically the process of the assistant putting everything together. It's like the assistant's thought process as it tries to understand your request and figure out which tools or functions to use to fulfill it.
So in our London weather example,
Mhm.
the entire back and forth about the weather happens within a thread.
Hmm.
And during that run, the assistant realizes it needs both the get current temperature and the get rain probability function to give us a complete answer.
Exactly. And here's where it gets even more interesting. The assistant can actually run those functions simultaneously,
So-
which makes the whole process much faster. We call that parallel function calling.
Wow, that sounds super efficient.
Yeah.
It's like cooking multiple dishes at the same time instead of waiting for one to finish before starting the next.
Yeah, I like that analogy. Parallel function calling really allows the assistant to gather all the necessary information much faster and give you that instant gratification that we all love.
But what happens when the assistant needs our help to complete a task?
Hmm.
The docs mentioned requires action status. Can you shed some light on that?
Absolutely. So sometimes a function might need some additional information that the assistant just doesn't have access to. Maybe it needs you to clarify something or provide some missing data. And when that happens, the run enters what we call requires action state.
So it's like the assistant is saying, hey, I need your help to finish this.
Exactly. And it's up to us to provide the missing pieces of the puzzle.
Okay, so we've got assistance function calling, threads messages runs, and this requires action state. It's amazing how much is going on behind the scenes of a simple conversation with AI.
It is a lot to take in, but it's like learning the different parts of a machine. Once you understand how each piece works, the whole system becomes much clearer. And we're just getting started. There are a few more concepts that will really help you unlock the power of OpenAI. Remember, that requires action status we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Well, there's actually a time limit involved.
Oh, really? So we can't just leave the assistant hanging?
Exactly. We need to submit that missing information within 10 minutes or the run will expire.
Okay.
So it's like a friendly reminder from the assistant, hey, I'm still waiting for those details.
Okay, so we need to be on our toes and keep the conversation flowing. What are some other techniques that we can use to really enhance this back and forth with the assistant? The docs mentioned something called streaming, which sounds intriguing.
Streaming is a fantastic way to make the interaction feel more dynamic and natural. Imagine you ask the assistant a question that requires a lot of processing, like generating a long piece of text or analyzing a complex data set with streaming. You don't have to wait for the entire response to be generated before you see anything.
So instead of getting one big chunk of text at the end,
Yeah.
it's like we're seeing the response being typed out in real time, like character by character.
Exactly. It's like having a live conversation with the assistant.
That's pretty cool.
And it's not just limited to text. You can stream structured data, which is where our next concept comes in structured output.
Okay, structured outputs. I remember that we touched upon that a little bit earlier. It has something to do with making sure the assistant's responses are organized and predictable, right?
Yes, it's about making sure the information we get back from the assistant is in a format that's easy to work with.
Okay.
Think of it this way. If you ask the assistant to create a shopping list,
Uh-huh.
you don't want a jumbled mess of words. You want a neatly formatted list, maybe with categories, quantities, and even checkboxes.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. So instead of just getting a wall of text, we can get back information that's already organized and ready to use. How do we tell the assistant to give us those beautifully structured outputs?
We use something called a schema, and you can think of a schema as a blueprint for the information.
Okay.
It tells the assistant what kind of data we're expecting and how we want it to be structured.
Okay.
So, for example, in our shopping list scenario, we would define the fields we want, like item name, quantity, and category, and specify their data types like text or numbers.
So we're essentially giving the assistant a template to follow.
Exactly. And there's a special parameter called strict true that we can use to make sure that the assistant adheres to that schema rigorously.
Okay.
It's like saying, hey, I'm serious about this structure, so stick to the blueprint.
All right. I'm starting to see the power of all these techniques.
Mm.
It's like we're not just passively receiving information from the assistant.
Right.
We're actively shaping the conversation and making sure the output is exactly what we need.
Right. That's a great way to put it. And the beauty of the OpenAI documentation is that it provides really clear examples and explanations for each of these concepts. Don't be afraid to experiment with the code snippets and try different configurations to see how they affect the output.
It's like having a playground to test out all these cool features.
Yeah.
But speaking of the documentation, I think it's time to address the elephant in the room. I know a lot of people, especially beginners, feel a bit overwhelmed when they first open those OpenAI docs.
Yeah.
Any advice for navigating that vast sea of information?
Absolutely. First and foremost, remember that you don't need to understand everything on the first pass.
Okay.
Don't get bogged down in every detail or try to memorize every concept. Start by getting a sense of the big picture, what's possible, what are the main building blocks, and where to find specific information when you need it.
So it's more about building a mental roadmap than trying to absorb everything at once.
Exactly. Think of it like exploring a new city. You wouldn't try to learn every street name and landmark on your first day, would you?
Definitely not. I'd probably just wander around and get a feel for the place first. So we should approach the OpenAI documentation in a similar way. Explore, get familiar with the layout, and don't be afraid to jump around and follow our curiosity.
Precisely. Use the table of contents and search function to your advantage. And don't forget about the code examples. They're incredibly valuable for seeing how these concepts are actually implemented in practice.
Right. The code examples are like little windows into how everything works.
And if you ever feel stuck or confused, remember that you're not alone. The OpenAI community is incredibly vast and supportive. There are tons of online resources, forums, and tutorials where you can find answers to your questions and connect with other developers.
It's like having a global network of coding buddies ready to lend a hand. So even though the OpenAI documentation might seem daunting at first, with the right approach and a supportive community, it becomes an exciting playground for learning and innovation.
Absolutely, and that's what makes this field so dynamic and rewarding. You're constantly learning, experimenting, and pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored assistance function, calling threads, messages, runs parallel processing, requires action state streaming, structured outputs, and even some tips for navigating the documentation itself. It's amazing how all these pieces fit together to create this powerful and versatile system.
It's like we've assembled a complex puzzle, and now we can see the beautiful picture that emerges.
And with this newfound knowledge, you're no longer wandering through a dense jungle of technical jargon. You've got a map, a compass, and a team of experienced explorers by your side, ready to guide you through the exciting world of OpenAI.
Yeah, it feels like we've gone from, feeling lost in the woods to having a clear path forward.
Definitely.
We've covered so much ground. We've explored assistance, function calling threads, messages, runs parallel processing that requires action state streaming, structured outputs, even how to approach those sometimes dense OpenAI docs. And the best part is this is just the beginning now that you have this solid understanding of the core concepts. You're ready to really dive into the OpenAI documentation with confidence and start building your own incredible applications.
Speaking of building, remember that weather assistant we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
That's a great starting point for putting all this knowledge into action. Why don't we challenge our listeners to take that concept and run with it?
I love that idea. How could you adapt the weather assistant to solve a problem that you encounter in your daily life? Could you build an assistant to manage your to-do list or automate those repetitive tasks or maybe even generate creative content? Think about the tools and techniques that we've discussed and how you can combine them to create something truly unique and helpful for you.
Yeah, that's an exciting challenge. Remember, every coding journey begins with a single step. Don't be afraid to experiment, make mistakes, and learn from every single experience. The OpenAI playground is your oyster.
The possibilities are endless. This is such a dynamic and rapidly evolving field. There's really no better time than now to dive in, explore, and become a part of this incredible AI revolution.
So go forth, Python pioneers, and unlock the power of OpenAI. Until next time, happy coding. Hey, everyone. Welcome back. It's time for another deep dive. And we're all about tackling those tricky topics head-on, Ray.
Yeah, getting right into it.
Today, it's all about the OpenAI documentation,
Yeah.
specifically for the Assistance API. We're focusing on the updates they rolled out back in April 2024.
That's right. There were some pretty significant changes, and we want to make sure you're not left in the dust.
Yeah. We know a lot of you out there, you're just getting started with Python. Maybe you got 3 months under your belt, something like that.
Yeah, around that point, where you're comfortable with the basics, but maybe this API stuff, it's still a bit of a mystery, right?
Exactly. So we're going to break it all down for you. No jargon, no fluff, just clear explanations and, hopefully a little bit of fun along the way too.
Absolutely. We want to make sure that after this deep dive, you can open up that documentation and actually feel excited to explore it.
Yeah, not intimidated. So to kick things off, let's talk about some of the coolest updates they've made.
All right.
One that really caught my eye was the improved file search tool.
Yeah, that one's a game changer for sure.
Imagine this. You can now search through 10,000 files per assistant. That's 500 times more than before.
It's incredible. And it's not just about the quantity either.
Right.
What really makes this tool stand out is its use of semantic search.
Okay, semantic search. That sounds pretty fancy. Break it down for us.
Well, basically, instead of just looking for exact keyword matches, it actually understands the meaning behind your search query.
Oh, wow.
So even if you don't use the exact words, it can still find what you're looking for based on context.
That's amazing. It's like having a research assistant who actually gets what you're asking.
Precisely.
All right, so we've got all these files. How do we organize them? That's where vector store objects come in.
Yes, vector store objects are essential for managing all this information effectively.
But what are they exactly? I mean, the name kind of sounds intimidating, at least to a beginner.
Yeah, it's simpler than it sounds. Think of it like this. When you add a file to a vector store, it basically reads and understands the file, breaks it down into smaller chunks of information, and then turns those chunks into special codes called embeddings.
Embeddings, like secret messages.
Uh-huh. Not quite secret messages, but they are kind of like a secret language that the AI understands.
Hmm.
These embeddings represent the meaning of each chunk mathematically.
So it's like translating the text into something the AI can process.
Exactly. And these embeddings are what makes semantic search possible. When you search through a vector store, the AI compares the meaning of your query with the meaning of each chunk in the store and finds the best matches. It's pretty cool.
Yeah, sounds like a very sophisticated system.
It is, but it's also designed to be user-friendly. And one of the best things about vector store objects is that you can use them across different assistants and threads.
So it's not like you have to create a separate vector store for each project.
Nope. Everything is streamlined and accessible in one central location, which is a huge benefit for developers who are juggling multiple projects.
Okay, that makes sense. Now let's talk about something that's always on everyone's mind when working with AI. Cost.
Right. That's a crucial consideration, especially for independent developers or startups.
Yeah, so how can we make sure we're not breaking the bank while still harnessing the power of the Assistance API?
Well, one of the key ways to manage costs is by setting token limits.
Okay, token limits. Can you explain what those are?
Sure. So basically, these powerful AI models process information in units called tokens. You can think of a token as a unit of meaning, like a word or a punctuation mark.
Okay, so every time the AI processes a token, there's a tiny cost associated with it.
Exactly. And by setting a token limit, you're basically setting a budget for your AI assistant.
It's like giving it a set amount of money and saying, don't spend more than this.
Precisely. And this is really important because it prevents any unexpected charges, especially if you're working on a project with a limited budget.
That's a relief. Now let's move on to something that's super exciting. Fine-tuning models. It sounds like you can really customize the AI's behavior with this.
Absolutely. Fine-tuning allows you to tailor the model to your specific needs. So let's say you're building a chatbot for a legal firm.
Okay.
You can fine-tune the model on legal documents and terminology to make sure its responses are accurate and professional.
So it's like giving the AI specialized training in a particular field.
Yes, exactly. And it goes beyond just language. You can fine-tune models for all sorts of tasks, making them incredibly versatile.
Now, last but not least,
They're streaming.
which seems perfect for creating interactive applications.
Yeah, streaming is a game changer for real-time interactions. Imagine you're building a chatbot, and instead of waiting for the whole response to load at once, you see the words appearing one by one, as if the AI is typing them out live.
Oh, that's cool.
It creates a much more engaging and dynamic experience for the user.
So with all these amazing updates, where does that leave someone who's just starting out with Python and the Assistance API? It seems like a lot to take in.
Well, it is a lot, but it's also incredibly exciting because it means you have all these powerful tools at your fingertips.
Right.
And by understanding these updates, you're not just learning how to use the API, you're learning how to think about problem solving with AI.
It's like having a map,
Yeah.
but instead of leading to a specific destination, it leads to endless possibilities.
Exactly. Now that you have a grasp of the core concepts in architecture, diving into the OpenAI documentation will feel much less daunting. And who knows, maybe you'll be the one to come up with the next big AI breakthrough.
Exactly. So go out there, explore, experiment, and see what amazing things you can
The
build.
future of AI is in your hands.
Until next time, stay curious and keep on coding.
We'll see you then.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks for listening. Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're going to be tackling OpenAI documentation, specifically the Assistance API.
All right.
Now, if you're like me, and you've got maybe like 3 months of Python experience, documentation can be a little,
Oh, yeah.
it can be a little scary,
For sure.
right? Like you're reading a foreign language sometimes,
Yeah.
but we're here to make it easy.
Yeah.
So think of this deep dive as like building a roadmap so you can navigate the docs with confidence.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. It's like, having a guidebook before you explore a new city. OpenAI recently rolled out some pretty big changes with the Assistance API.
Okay.
Moving from version 1 to version 2 and understanding these changes is really key to unlocking the full potential of their tools.
Okay, so V1 is out, V2 is in. Can you give us the lay of the land What are the major changes we need to be aware of?
Yeah, so one of the most significant shifts is how OpenAI handles files and tools.
Okay.
They've moved to a system where files are directly associated with the tools that use them.
So instead of having all the files in one big pile, it's more like each tool has its own toolbox.
Exactly. It's all about organization and efficiency.
I am all for organization.
Yeah.
My code can definitely use some of that. So how does this new system actually work?
Well, in V2, there's this thing called tool resources.
Okay.
Think of it like a master control panel where you manage all the tools and their associated files.
Okay, tool resources. Got it.
Yeah.
But what about the specifics? How are these files actually organized within tool resources?
So let's take the example of file search, a really handy tool for, well, searching through files. In V2, file search has its own dedicated space within tool resources, and that space uses something called vector stores to manage files.
Vector stores. That sounds a bit intimidating. What exactly are they?
Don't let the name scare you. Imagine vector stores as specialized filing cabinets for the file search tool. They help organize and index your files, making them easily searchable.
So it's like each tool has its own filing system, and vector stores are the cabinets specifically for the file search tool.
Precisely. And each tool has its specific way of organizing files within tool resources.
Okay.
For example, the code interpreter tool, which allows you to execute code directly within the OpenAI environment, has its own designated area within tool resources for managing code files.
So tool resources is like the main hub,
Yeah.
and within that, each tool has its own little compartment for managing its files.
Yeah.
That actually makes a lot of sense. It's like organizing a workshop. Each tool has its designated spot.
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
And this structure has a real impact on how you use the API. Instead of thinking about files as independent entities, you need to think about them in relation to the tools that use them.
That's a good point. It's a shift in perspective.
Yeah.
So if I want to use a particular tool, I first need to figure out how to add the necessary files to its designated space within tool resources.
You got it. And OpenAI has made this process pretty straightforward. Remember how in V1 we use things called assistant file and message file to manage files?
Vaguely.
Yeah.
It's all starting to come back to me now.
Well, in V2, those are replaced by tool resources, which makes things much more streamlined.
So no more assistant file and message file, just tool resources for everything.
Yeah.
That's a welcome simplification.
Yeah.
But what happens to all my old files from V1?
Right.
Do I have to manually migrate everything over?
So you'll be relieved to hear that OpenAI has taken care of that for you. They've designed the migration process to be as smooth as possible. Your existing assistant file and message file data will be automatically mapped to the new tool resources structure.
It is a huge relief.
Yeah.
I was picturing myself spending hours manually transferring files.
Yeah.
So even though V2 is the new standard,
Right.
my old V1 data is still accessible.
Absolutely. Your V1 data will be integrated into the V2 structure. It's like having a historical record of your projects.
Yeah.
But remember, it's a one-way street.
Yeah.
Any changes you make in V2 won't be reflected back in V1.
Okay, so it's like having a read-only archive of my V1 data within the V2 system.
Yeah.
That's actually pretty useful.
Exactly. It allows you to see how your projects have evolved over time.
So we've covered the basics of tool resources and how files are now organized. What else is new in V2?
Well, they've also made some changes to how you add files to messages.
Okay.
In V2, they've introduced something called attachments.
Attachments. That sounds familiar. Is it like attaching a file to an email?
Exactly.
Okay.
It's a much more user-friendly way to incorporate files into your messages.
Yeah.
Instead of dealing with file IDs directly, you simply attach the file and the API takes care of the rest.
That sounds way easier than whatever we were doing before.
It is. And this ties back into the whole concept of tool resources. When you attach a file to a message, it's automatically added to the appropriate tools resources.
So attaching a file is like sending it straight to the right toolbox.
You got it. It's all designed to make the process more intuitive and efficient.
Okay, this is starting to make a lot of sense.
Yeah.
I'm already feeling less intimidated by the documentation.
That's great to hear. And remember, we're just scratching the surface here.
Right.
But once you grasp these fundamental changes, you'll be well on your way to mastering the OpenAI API.
Awesome. Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come back and dive into some of the really cool tools that are available in V2.
Sounds good.
All right, it's starting to feel like I'm getting a handle on this whole V2 thing. But before we move on, can we talk a bit more about those specific tools that you mentioned? I think understanding what they do will really help solidify my understanding of how everything fits together.
Absolutely. Let's dive into the tools themselves. We've already touched on file search and vector stores, so let's start there. As we discussed, file search is your go-to tool for finding specific information within your files. It's like having a super-powered search engine specifically designed for your OpenAI project.
And those vector stores act like specialized filing cabinets for file search.
Right. Exactly. They help organize and index your files, making the search process incredibly efficient. Think of it this way. When you search for something on Google, you're not sifting through every single web page on the internet. Google uses complex algorithms to index and categorize websites so it can quickly deliver the most relevant results. Vector stores do something similar for your OpenAI projects.
That makes sense. So I upload my files to a vector store, and then file search can quickly sift through them to find the information I need. Pretty cool. What about that other tool you mentioned, the code interpreter? What's its superpower?
Now, the code interpreter is where things get really interesting. It essentially allows you to execute code directly within the OpenAI environment. It's like having a mini programming lab right inside your AI project.
Hold on. I can actually run code within OpenAI.
Yeah.
That's amazing. What kind of code can I run? Can I use Python since that's what I'm learning?
You absolutely can use Python with the code interpreter.
Yeah.
And it's not limited to just simple scripts. You can use it for data analysis, image manipulation, web scraping, all sorts of things.
Wow, that opens up a world of possibilities. Can you give me an example of how I might use the code interpreter in a real project?
Let's say you're building a chatbot that needs to provide information about a product based on a series of PDF documents. You could use the code interpreter to extract the relevant text from those PDFs, process the data, and then feed it to your chatbot's knowledge base.
That's brilliant. So instead of manually extracting information from those PDFs, I can just write a Python script using the code interpreter to do it for me.
Exactly. It automates the entire process and saves you a ton of time and effort.
Okay, I'm officially sold on the code interpreter. It sounds like a game changer for someone like me who's still learning the ropes.
It's a powerful tool for sure, and it's just one example of the many tools available within the OpenAI ecosystem. As you explore the documentation, you'll discover a whole suite of tools designed to help you build incredible AI applications.
Speaking of documentation, I have to admit I'm still a bit apprehensive about diving into those docs. I know you've said they're designed to be more user-friendly in V2, but where do I even begin? It all seems so vast.
I hear you. Documentation can be daunting, especially when you're first starting out. My advice is to approach it like you would a good book. Don't try to absorb everything at once. Start with the introduction or overview section to get a general sense of what the API is all about. Then focus on the specific tools or features that you're most interested in using.
Okay, so start with the big picture and then zoom in on the areas that are most relevant to my project. That makes sense. Are there any particular sections or resources within the documentation that you'd recommend for someone with my level of experience?
Absolutely. The OpenAI team has done a great job of providing clear and concise tutorials and guides. I'd recommend checking out the Quick Start section, which will walk you through the basics of creating an assistant and using some of the core tools. They also have a dedicated example section with code snippets and real-world use cases.
So the quick start section for the fundamentals and the example section for inspiration and hands-on learning. Perfect.
You got it. And don't be afraid to experiment. The OpenAI Playground is a fantastic resource for testing out different tools and parameters without having to write a lot of code.
Oh, the playground. I've heard about that. Is it kind of like a sandbox where I can play around without breaking anything?
Exactly. It's a safe space to experiment and learn. You can try out different prompts, adjust parameters, and see how the API responds in real time.
That sounds like a fun way to learn. I'm definitely going to check that out. So we've talked about the overall structure of V2, the tools, and how to approach the documentation. Is there anything else I should be aware of before I dive in?
There's one crucial aspect we need to touch upon, the concept of asynchronous operations. This is particularly important when working with vector stores.
Asynchronous operations. That rings a bell, but can you remind me what that means exactly?
Sure. In simple terms, an asynchronous operation means that a task can run in the background without blocking the main program flow. It's like ordering food at a restaurant. You don't have to sit and stare at the kitchen door until your food is ready. You can continue chatting with your friends, and the waiter will bring your food when it's done.
Okay, I get the analogy. So how does that apply to vector stores?
When you upload files to a vector store, the process of indexing and preparing those files for search can take some time. But you don't have to wait for that process to finish before you can start using other tools or features. The vector store does its thing in the background, and you can continue working on other aspects of your project.
So it's like the vector store is the kitchen, and I'm the diner who can go about my business while my food is being prepared.
Exactly. And that's why understanding asynchronous operations is so important. You need to be aware that certain tasks might not happen instantaneously, and you might need to build in some checks to ensure that things are ready before you try to use them.
That makes a lot of sense. I can see how not understanding that could lead to some frustrating errors. So what's the best way to handle asynchronous operations in my code?
The OpenAI API provides mechanisms for checking the status of asynchronous operations and handling them appropriately. We'll dive into those details in the next part of our deep dive.
Okay, looking forward to that. We've covered a lot of ground already, and I'm feeling much more confident about tackling the OpenAI documentation. But before we move on to the more technical aspects, I think we could all use a little break to let this information sink in. All right, we're back and ready to tackle the final stretch of our OpenAI Assistant's API v2 journey. We've talked about tool resources, explored some cool tools like file search and code interpreters, and even dipped our toes into the world of asynchronous operations. What else do we need to know to truly master these new features?
Great question. Now that you have a solid grasp of the core concepts, let's talk about how to put this knowledge into practice. Remember, the best way to learn any new technology is to roll up your sleeves and start building something.
I like where this is going. So where should I start? What's the first thing I should do to put all this V2 knowledge into action?
I'd recommend starting with a simple project that uses one or two of the tools we've discussed. Maybe try building a basic chatbot that can answer questions based on a small set of text files.
Okay, a simple chatbot. I can handle that. What's the best way to approach this from a V2 perspective? I know we talked about organizing files using tool resources, but can you walk me through an example?
Sure. Let's say you have a few text files containing information about different products. The first step is to create a vector store specifically for this project. You can think of it as a dedicated knowledge base for your chatbot.
So a vector store just for product information. Got it. What do I do next?
Once you have your vector store set up, you need to upload those text files to it. This is where those asynchronous operations we talked about come into play. The vector store will work behind the scenes to index and prepare those files for search.
Okay, so I upload the files and the vector store does its magic in the background.
Yeah.
What happens next?
Now it's time to create your assistant. This is where you'll specify which tools the assistant will use and how it will access those tools. In this case, you'll want to include the file search tool and tell it to use your product information vector store as its source of data.
So I'm basically telling the assistant, hey, if you need to answer questions about products, go check out this vector store.
That's a perfect way to put it. You're essentially configuring the assistant to use the right tools and resources for the task at hand.
Okay, I'm with you so far. So I have my files organized in a vector store, and I've created an assistant that knows how to access that vector store. Now what?
Now comes the fun part, interacting with your assistant. You can start asking it questions about the products, and it will use the file search tool to scan through the information in the vector store and provide relevant answers.
That's so cool. It's like having a mini expert on demand. But what if I need to update the information or add new product files?
That's easy. You can simply upload new files to the vector store, and the assistant will automatically have access to the updated information.
Wow, this whole system is incredibly flexible and powerful. I'm starting to see how these V2 changes can really streamline the development process.
They absolutely can. And the more you work with the API, the more you'll appreciate the thought and care that went into designing these new features. But remember, there's always a learning curve when it comes to new technology.
Oh, for sure. I'm already anticipating some head-scratching moments as I dive into building my first project. Any advice for handling those inevitable bumps in the road?
Don't be afraid to experiment. That's how you learn and discover new possibilities. The OpenAI Playground is a great place to test out different ideas and approaches without worrying about breaking anything.
The playground, my new best friend. What about debugging? Any tips for troubleshooting those pesky errors that always seem to pop up at the worst possible time?
When it comes to debugging, good old-fashioned problem-solving skills are your best asset. Carefully examine your code, identify potential issues, and test your solutions methodically. And remember, the OpenAI community is a valuable resource. Don't hesitate to reach out for help if you get stuck.
That's reassuring. I know there's a whole community of developers out there who have probably faced the same challenges. It's good to know I'm not alone in this journey.
You're definitely not alone, and that's one of the great things about the OpenAI community. Everyone is learning and supporting each other.
Well, I have to say, I'm feeling a lot more confident about tackling the OpenAI documentation and exploring all these new V2 features. Thanks for breaking it down for me in such a clear and understandable way.
My pleasure. Remember, the key to mastering any new technology is to embrace the learning process, experiment, and have fun. The possibilities with OpenAI are truly endless, and I can't wait to see what you create.
That's it for our deep dive into the OpenAI Assistance API V2. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and are feeling inspired to start building your own amazing AI applications. Until next time, happy coding. Okay, so have you ever tried to actually just open the OpenAI documentation?
Oh, yeah.
It can be a little bit intimidating,
It is a lot.
especially when you're, maybe just starting out with Python.
Yeah, and it keeps changing so rapidly that
Yeah,
it can be hard to keep up.
exactly.
But we're here to help sort of break it down.
Yeah, we're going to demystify this thing today.
Okay,
So you can navigate it like a pro, and we know you've got 3 months of Python experience under your belt.
right, which
Well,
is awesome.
yeah.
Get the basics down.
Yes, so we'll make sure everything makes sense from kind of where you're standing with your coding journey.
Exactly. No need to be a coding ninja or anything to get the most out of OpenAI.
Just the basics and a little bit of curiosity.
Yeah.
So think of this deep dive as we're building a mental roadmap before you actually set foot in the documentation jungle.
I like that, yeah.
The mental roadmap.
And one of the most exciting areas we'll be exploring is this whole world of custom GPTs
Okay.
and something called GPT actions. GPT actions are very cool.
Have you ever wished you could just tell ChatGPT to do things for you?
Oh, yeah, all the time.
Like book a flight or order food,
Of course.
pull data from a website?
Uh-huh.
That's essentially what this lets you do.
That's what custom GPTs and GPT actions let you do. You can build personalized versions of ChatGPT that are tailored for very specific tasks, and then you can connect them to all sorts of external tools and services.
Wait, so I can create my own custom version of ChatGPT?
You can.
That's pretty wild.
Yeah.
But what's the difference between custom GPTs and these GPT actions you're talking about?
So think of it like this: the custom GPT is the overall framework. So it's like your personalized assistant.
Okay.
And the GPT actions are the specific skills or abilities that you give to that assistant.
Okay, I'm starting to see the picture here.
Yeah.
So if I want my custom GPT to be able to pull weather data, for example,
Yeah.
I'd need to equip it with a GPT action that knows how to talk to a weather service API or something.
You got it. GPT actions are the bridge between natural language,
Book?
the way we talk to ChatGPT, and the API world, which is how software applications talk to each other.
This is blowing my mind a little bit. I always
Yeah.
thought APIs were this super technical thing that only hardcore programmers could deal with.
Right, and that's the beauty of GPT actions is that they take all that complexity and hide it behind the scenes.
Okay.
You don't need to write a single line of code to use them.
Okay.
You just talk to your custom GPT in plain English, and the GPT action figures out what API calls to make and how to get the information you need.
So instead of me needing to learn all the ins and outs of APIs, I can just focus on what I want to accomplish. And the GPT action takes care of all the technical stuff.
Exactly. It's like having a personal translator that speaks both human and API.
That is incredibly powerful.
Yeah.
It feels like this opens up a whole world of possibilities for people who aren't necessarily coders but want to build cool things with AI.
Absolutely. GPT actions are really democratizing access to powerful tools and information that were previously locked away behind technical barriers.
Okay, I'm definitely hooked on this concept, but I'm also a little nervous about actually diving into the documentation and trying to figure out how to build these things.
Yeah.
Where should someone even start?
Well, the good news is that the OpenAI documentation, while dense, is actually very well structured.
Okay.
And once you understand the basic layout, it becomes much less intimidating.
So it's like having a map for the jungle.
Exactly.
Are there any particular landmarks we should be on the lookout for?
Absolutely. There are a few key sections that are particularly helpful for understanding custom GPTs and GPT actions.
Okay.
One is the Quick Start Guide, which will walk you through setting up your first custom GPT.
Okay, that sounds like a good starting point. What else?
Definitely check out the Actions Library.
Oh.
It's a collection of pre-built GPT actions that you can use as inspiration or even plug directly into your custom GPTs.
Oh, so it's like a recipe book for GPT actions.
Yes.
I can see how that would be really helpful
Yeah.
for getting a sense of what's possible.
Right.
Yeah.
And as you get more comfortable, you can dive into the more technical sections like the API reference, which will give you the nitty-gritty details of how to interact with various APIs.
This is starting to feel a lot less overwhelming now that we have a sense of the lay of the land.
Right.
It's like we've got our map and compass ready to go.
That's exactly the idea. But before we set off on our expedition, let's take a closer look at what these GPT actions can actually do.
Sounds good to me. I'm ready for a deeper dive into this whole GPT action magic.
All right, let's imagine a scenario where you're planning a trip and you want to pack the right clothes.
Okay.
Instead of manually checking a weather app, what if you could just ask your custom GPT,
Mm-hmm.
what should I pack for my trip to Washington, D.C. this weekend?
Now that's what I call a smart travel buddy.
Right.
But how would a GPT action actually make that happen?
Behind the scenes, the GPT action would be making API calls to a service like weather.gov to get the latest forecast for Washington, D.C.
Okay, so it's actually reaching out to external websites and services to get the information I need. That's impressive.
It is.
But I'm guessing there's some serious technical wizardry happening under the hood to make that work.
There is, but the beauty of GPT actions is that you don't need to worry about those complexities. The GPT action handles all the technical details for you. It knows how to format the API requests, how to interpret the responses, and how to present the information in a way that makes sense to you.
So for someone like me who's still learning the ropes of Python, I can focus on the big picture of what I want to achieve, and the GPT action takes care of the coding magic behind the scenes.
Precisely. It's like having a team of expert coders working behind the scenes to make your ideas come to life.
That's an awesome way to put it. I'm feeling way more confident about tackling this whole GPT action thing now.
Great. Let's dig a little deeper into how those API calls actually work.
Okay.
You mentioned weather.gov, so let's stick with that example.
Okay.
To get a weather forecast, the GPT action would need to make a couple of specific API calls.
Okay, let's break it down. What would those calls look like?
First, it would use something called the points API.
Points API.
This takes your location, in this case the latitude and longitude of Washington, D.C., and finds the closest weather station to give you the most accurate data.
So it's like pinpointing exactly where on the map my weather information should be coming from.
Exactly.
That makes sense.
Then, using the information from that first call,
Right.
it would make another API call to forecast to get the actual weather prediction for your trip dates.
So it's like a two-step process. First, find the right location, then fetch the forecast.
You got it. And the GPT action orchestrates all of this seamlessly in the background. You just ask your question and it takes care of the rest.
This is starting to feel like less of a jungle and more like a well-organized park with clear paths and helpful signs.
Right?
I'm really starting to see how GPT actions can unlock some serious potential.
And this is just scratching the surface. We'll dive into even more detail about how those API calls work in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah.
But for now, the key takeaway is that GPT actions make it possible to interact with all sorts of external tools and services without needing to write a single line of code.
I'm already buzzing with ideas for what I could build with this technology.
That's the spirit. But before we get too carried away, let's take a quick break and come back for part 2, where we'll dissect those API calls and really get into the nuts and bolts of how GPT actions work.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah.
I'm ready to see what other treasures we can unearth in the OpenAI documentation.
All right.
Okay. All right. So before the break, we were getting into how these GPT actions actually work their magic with APIs.
Yes, and we left off with that weather example
Mm-hmm.
where the GPT action needed to talk to weather.gov
Right.
to get a forecast.
And I remember you saying it needs to make 2 API calls, one to points and another to forecasts.
Yes.
But honestly, I'm still a little fuzzy on what those actually look like.
Yes.
It all sounds pretty technical.
It might sound intimidating,
Yeah.
but remember, the goal here is to make this super clear for you.
Okay, good.
Think of it like this. Each of those API calls is kind of like sending a text message to the weather service.
Okay, I can picture that. What's in the message?
The message is written in a special language that computers understand called JSON.
Jason?
And you don't need to be fluent in JSON to use GPT actions,
Okay.
but it helps to have a general idea of what it looks like.
Okay, so what would that JSON text message for the points API look like?
It's actually pretty simple.
Okay.
It just needs the latitude and longitude of the location you're interested in.
Okay.
So for Washington, D.C., the JSON would be like saying, hey, I'm at this spot on the map.
Okay.
Tell me about the nearest weather station.
So it's like giving the weather service my GPS coordinates so they know exactly where to look.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then the weather service sends back a reply message,
Okay.
also in JSON format, with details about the closest weather station.
Okay, so that's the points API call.
Right.
What about the second one, forecast?
For that one, the JSON message would include information about the weather station we got from the first call, along with the dates of your trip.
Okay.
So it's like saying, okay, now that you know where I am, tell me what the weather will be like on these specific dates.
So the second API call builds on the information we got from the first one.
Right.
It's like a
Yep.
two-part conversation
Yes.
with the Weather Service.
Exactly. And all this communication is happening behind the scenes thanks to the GPT action.
Right.
You don't see any of this JSON back and forth. You just get a nicely formatted weather forecast
Okay.
presented to you by your custom GPT.
I have to admit, it's pretty amazing how much complexity is being handled behind the scenes to make this all work so seamlessly.
It is. And that's the power of OpenAI and GPT actions. They're designed to make powerful AI capabilities accessible to everyone, even if you're not a coding expert.
So even though there's all this JSON and API stuff happening in the background, I don't actually need to know the ins and outs of how it works to use it.
Not at all. Think of it like driving a car.
Yeah.
You don't need to understand how the engine works to get from point A to point B.
Okay.
Similarly, GPT actions handle all the technical heavy lifting, so you can focus on what you want to accomplish.
That's a great analogy. But let's say I am curious, and I
Yeah.
want to learn more about how this all works under the hood.
Yeah.
Where in the OpenAI documentation should I go to find that information?
The API reference section is your go-to for that level of detail. It breaks down each API call, explains the different parameters, and provides examples of how to use them.
So if I want to get my hands dirty and really understand the nuts and bolts, the API reference is the place to be,
Exactly. But remember, you don't need to become an API expert overnight.
right?
Start with the quick start guide and the actions library to get a feel for things, and then gradually dive deeper into the technical documentation as you get more comfortable.
Okay, that makes sense. I'm starting to feel a lot more confident about navigating the documentation now that we've kind of demystified some of the key concepts.
That's great to hear. Remember, the OpenAI documentation is like a treasure map,
Uh-huh.
and we're here to help you find the X that marks the spot for building amazing things with GPT actions.
This has been super helpful.
Mm.
So what's next on our documentation adventure?
Well, we've covered the basics of custom GPTs, GPT actions, and how they interact with APIs, but there's another key piece of the puzzle that we need to talk about: function calling.
Function calling? Okay, this sounds like we're getting into the really technical stuff now.
Don't worry, we'll keep it simple. Remember how we talked about GPT actions being like bridges between natural language and the API world?
Right.
Well, function calling is the mechanism that makes those bridges possible.
So it's like the nuts and bolts that hold the bridge together.
Exactly. Function calling is how the GPT action figures out what API calls to make based on what you're asking it to do.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Let's unpack this function calling thing a bit more. Okay, so we've covered custom GPTs and GPT actions and APIs and even this thing called function calling.
We have. It's a lot.
Yeah, it's a lot to take there. My brain is definitely full.
Yeah, it is a lot to digest, but the key, like with anything, is to kind of approach it step by step.
Right.
And just keep in mind kind of what your goals are as you're moving through.
Totally.
So we've talked about a few sections of the OpenAI documentation, the quick start guide, and the actions library, and the API reference. But before we wrap up, I want to highlight one more resource that can be incredibly helpful,
Okay.
and that's the function calling guide.
Okay, a whole guide dedicated to function calling.
Yep.
Sounds like this must be a pretty important concept.
Yep.
What exactly does this guide cover?
So this guide really dives into the mechanics of how function calling works and how you can use it to create more powerful and more dynamic GPT actions.
So if the quick start guide is like learning to drive a car, the function calling guide is like popping open the hood and learning how the engine works.
That's a great analogy. The quick start guide gets you up and running quickly, but the function calling guide gives you like a deeper understanding of what's happening under the hood.
Okay, I see how all these different pieces of the documentation fit together,
Yeah.
but I have to admit I'm still a little intimidated by the thought of actually diving in and trying to build something myself.
Yeah.
Do you have any advice for someone who's feeling a bit overwhelmed?
I think the best advice I can give is don't try to learn everything at once.
Right.
Start with the basics, follow the examples, and don't be afraid to experiment.
Yeah.
The OpenAI documentation is designed to be interactive,
Right.
so you can actually try out the code snippets and see how they work in real time.
That's really helpful. So it's not just about like reading the documentation passively, it's about actively engaging with it
Yeah,
and trying things out.
absolutely. And the more you experiment, the more comfortable you'll become with the concepts and the tools. And remember, the OpenAI community is incredibly supportive. If you get stuck, there are tons of resources online, including forums and tutorials where you can ask questions and get help from other developers.
That's really reassuring to hear. I'm starting to feel a lot more confident about tackling the OpenAI documentation now.
That's what we were hoping for, and that's exactly what we were hoping to achieve with this deep dive.
Yeah.
The goal wasn't to overwhelm you with technical details, but to give you a clear roadmap for
Right.
navigating the documentation and understanding the key concepts.
And you've definitely succeeded. I feel like I've gone from feeling lost in a jungle to having a compass and a map and a sense of excitement about exploring this new territory.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, this is just the beginning of your journey with OpenAI and GPT actions.
Yeah.
As you dive deeper into the documentation and start building your own custom GPTs, you'll discover a whole world of possibilities for creating innovative solutions and automating tasks in ways that you never thought possible.
I can't wait to see what I can build. Thanks for being such an awesome guide through the OpenAI documentation. I feel like I've learned a ton today.
Well, it's been my pleasure. And remember, the most important thing is to have fun and keep experimenting. That's how you'll truly unlock the power of OpenAI.
Well said. And that brings us to the end of our deep dive into the OpenAI documentation. We hope you found this helpful and that you're feeling inspired to start building your own custom GPTs. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with AI. All right, so let's say you've been learning Python for, I don't know, like 3 months or so,
Yeah.
and you're itching to start using the OpenAI API.
Yeah.
But when you open that documentation, it's kind of like, whoa, where do I even begin? It can be a little intimidating, right?
Absolutely.
So that's exactly what we're here for today. We're going to break it all down, give you a good mental roadmap
A mental map. Yeah, that's the goal.
before you even open up the docs.
Exactly. Avoid that info overload.
Right.
Let's talk about GPT actions.
Okay.
This is where things get really, really cool because now you can connect your GPT to, other systems, APIs, think real-world data.
So it's more than just like, generating text.
Right.
We're talking about GPTs actually like interacting with the world outside of themselves.
Exactly. The example they use in the documentation is a weather forecast GPT.
Okay.
Imagine you're planning a trip. Instead of just getting a generic packing list, your GPT could actually pull in live weather data and tell you, hey, looks like rain in DC, pack an umbrella.
Okay, that's super practical. I'm starting to get the appeal. But how does a GPT even know how to talk to something like a weather API?
That's where the OpenAPI schema comes in. It's like a universal translator, right? It lays out how the GPT can communicate with that API, what kind of data it can request, and how that data is formatted.
So the GPT needs that schema to make sense of like what the API is sending back.
Yes.
It's not just magically understanding weather data.
You got it. And here's a cool tip from the documentation. You can actually use a different GPT to help you create this schema.
Oh, wow.
They give you a specific prompt that you can use,
Whoa.
which is a huge time saver.
That's meta.
It is.
Using a GPT to help you build a GPT.
Yeah. Yeah.
I like it. But even with a schema, how do we make sure this is all working properly before we, unleash this thing on the world?
Testing is key.
Yeah.
Especially with APIs, right? You don't want your GPT going rogue, calling the wrong data.
Yeah.
The documentation recommends using Postman.
Okay.
It's free. And it lets you test those API calls directly before you integrate them with your GPT.
So Postman is like a safe sandbox to kind of play around in.
It is.
What are the advantages of using it?
The great thing about Postman is that it provides detailed error messages.
Okay.
So if something's not working, it'll point you in the right direction.
Hmm.
Plus, you can import your OpenAPI schema directly into Postman so things are nice and streamlined.
Okay, so we've got our schema. We've tested the API calls in Postman.
Right.
What's next in actually building this? Like custom GPT weather guru.
Now we get to the heart of it. We're going to create the custom GPT within the OpenAI platform.
Okay.
You give it a name, you add that OpenAPI schema we talked about, and you set up any authentication if it's needed.
Okay, walk me through this. Where do I start once I'm in the OpenAI platform?
So step one is you want to give your custom GPT a name, something that makes sense, like
Yeah,
Weather GPT for this example.
got it. And then I would add the OpenAPI schema.
Exactly. There's a section in the platform where you upload your schema. You're essentially giving your GPT the instruction manual for how to talk to the Weather API.
Okay, that makes sense. And what about authentication?
So some APIs require authentication. That's like a digital handshake to prove you have permission to access their data.
Right.
Luckily, for this example, the Weather API we're using doesn't require authentication.
Okay.
So you can skip that step for now.
That's good news for a beginner.
It is.
But what if I was working with a different API that did require authentication?
The documentation covers that as well.
Okay.
You'll find detailed guidance and examples for all the common authentication methods. OpenAI has done a great job making this process as clear as possible.
Okay, phew. So authentication sounds a little intimidating, but it's good to know that the documentation has my back.
It does.
So once I've added the schema and I've dealt with any authentication, what's next?
Now comes the fun part. We're going to write instructions for your GPT.
Oh.
These instructions guide the GPT on how to use the API. What data should it request? What should it do with the response?
So the instructions are kind of like giving the GPT a set of commands, basically.
You got it. And it's really important to make those instructions clear and specific.
Yeah.
Remember, the GPT is powerful, but it still needs very precise guidance to know exactly what to do.
Okay, that makes sense. Is there a way to test those instructions before I set the whole thing live?
Absolutely. There's a test button within the OpenAI platform that lets you try out individual actions.
Oh, okay.
So you can check that each API call is working as expected before you move on.
So it's like a mini quality control check along the way.
Exactly.
Yeah, I can see how that would save a lot of headaches later on.
It does. And speaking of quality control, let's talk about evaluation.
Okay.
You want to make sure your custom GPT isn't just, technically sound, but also provides a great user experience.
Okay, so we're thinking beyond just making sure the code works, right?
Yeah.
What should I be looking for in terms of the user experience?
The documentation introduces this concept of an evaluation set. Basically, you come up with a bunch of realistic questions a user might ask your GPT
Okay.
and think about the different ways they might phrase things, what information they're really looking for, how they expect the GPT to respond.
Okay, so for our weather GPT, I might ask questions like, what's the weather like in D.C. this weekend? Or should I pack a jacket for my trip to New York?
Exactly.
Just to see how it handles different types of requests.
Exactly. And you can get creative and test some more challenging scenarios too. Like, what if the user asks,
Okay.
what should I pack for a trip to the White House this weekend? That implies they need to know the weather, but they haven't explicitly asked for a forecast.
That's a great point. So the evaluation set is not just about testing the technical functionality. It's also about making sure that the GPT can understand the user's intent,
Yes.
even if it's not explicitly stated.
You got it. And the more thorough your evaluation set is, the more confident you can be that your custom GPT is ready for the real world.
This is all starting to make a lot more sense. It feels like we're kind of breaking down the process into these manageable chunks.
Yeah.
Which is definitely easing my pre-documentation anxiety.
Good. That's what we're aiming for.
Yeah.
Remember, the documentation itself is incredibly detailed, super comprehensive.
Right.
But having this high-level understanding before you dive in can make all the difference.
Absolutely. It's like having a roadmap before you set out on a journey, right?
Exactly.
You know the general direction, but you can still refer to the map for specific directions and landmarks along the way.
Exactly. And speaking of landmarks, let's talk about some of the common challenges you might encounter when you're working with GPT actions.
Oh.
Even when you're following the documentation to a T.
Okay, that sounds super helpful because I'm sure there are some gotchas lurking in the shadows that I wouldn't even think to look for.
Oh, absolutely. Even experienced developers run into these from time to time.
Yeah.
One of the most common is when your GPT seems to be calling the wrong API endpoint,
Okay.
no matter how many times you check your code.
Oh, I can see how that would be frustrating, especially if you're confident that your code is correct.
Right.
What might be causing that kind of issue?
Well, remember, your GPT is relying on two main things to understand which API endpoint to call. Your instructions and the Open API schema.
Okay.
So if it's consistently making the wrong call, it usually means there's an issue with one of those two things.
So it's back to the basics.
Yeah.
Double checking my instructions for clarity.
Right.
And then making sure the descriptions in my Open API schema are, accurate
Yeah.
and unambiguous.
Exactly. It's amazing how often a simple typo or a vaguely worded description can throw everything off.
Right.
Think of it like giving someone directions, but you're missing street names or unclear landmarks. They're bound to get lost.
That's a great analogy.
Right.
It really highlights the importance of clear communication.
Here
right?
it says.
Not just in human language, but also in the language of code and APIs.
You got it. And here's a helpful tip.
Okay.
When you're debugging these kinds of issues, Try to step back and think about it from the user's perspective.
Hmm.
What is the user asking?
Right.
What information are they expecting to receive?
Yeah.
By putting yourself in the user's shoes, you can often identify inconsistencies
Hmm.
or ambiguities
Right.
in your instructions or schema that might be leading the GPT astray.
That's such a valuable insight because it's easy to get caught up in the technical details.
It is.
But ultimately, we're building these applications for human users.
Right.
So understanding their needs and expectations is paramount.
Absolutely. And speaking of user expectations,
Okay.
let's talk about another common challenge you might encounter. What happens if your GPT is calling the correct API endpoint,
Okay.
but it's not using the parameters correctly?
Okay, so the GPT is talking to the right API, but it's not asking the right questions.
Exactly.
I can see how that would lead to some pretty wacky results.
It does. For instance, imagine you're building a custom GPT that can search for books, right?
Hmm.
Using a book API, the user asks for books by a specific author,
Okay.
but the GPT keeps returning results for a completely different author.
Hmm.
What might be going on there?
Well, in that case, I would suspect that there's an issue with how the GPT is like mapping the user's input,
Yeah.
the author's name,
Right.
to the API's parameters.
Right.
Maybe there's a mismatch in formatting,
Yeah.
or the GPT is grabbing the wrong piece of information from the user's request.
You're on the right track. When dealing with API parameters, it's crucial to ensure that your GPT is correctly interpreting the user's input and translating it into the format that the API expects.
Right.
This often involves data manipulation and transformation within your GPT's instructions.
Okay, so it's like being a translator
Yeah.
between two different languages, basically.
It-
Making sure that the message is conveyed accurately and effectively.
Exactly. And here's another helpful tip for troubleshooting these kinds of parameter issues.
Yeah.
Try using Postman to test your API calls directly,
Okay.
bypassing the GPT for a moment.
Right.
This allows you to isolate any issues with how the parameters are being handled and make sure the API is responding as expected
Right.
before you integrate it back into your GPT.
Okay, so that's a great strategy. It's like isolating a variable in a scientific experiment.
Yes,
Controlling for potential sources of error to try to pinpoint the root cause.
precisely. And once you've confirmed that the API is working correctly with the intended parameters, you can then focus on refining your GPT's instructions to ensure it's accurately mapping the user's input to those parameters.
Okay, so we've covered calling the wrong endpoint,
Yeah.
messing up the parameters.
Yeah.
What other common challenges should we be aware of?
Sometimes the GPT is technically doing everything right,
Okay.
but the response it gives back is just not what you're hoping for.
Like it's missing the point of the user's request,
Right.
or the information is presented in a way that's like confusing or unhelpful.
Exactly. This is where the art of prompt engineering comes in.
Okay.
It's all about crafting those instructions in a way that elicits the most accurate,
Yeah.
helpful, and even creative responses from your GPT.
So it's not just about telling the GPT what to do, it's about telling it how to do it
Right.
in a way that aligns with the user's expectations.
You got it. Think of it like giving directions to someone. You wouldn't just say, get to this destination.
Right.
You'd provide specific landmarks, street names, maybe even tips on avoiding traffic or finding scenic routes.
I love that analogy because it's like
Yeah.
prompt engineering is like being a tour guide for our GPTs, basically.
It is.
We're not just giving them a destination, we're crafting the entire journey to ensure a smooth and enjoyable experience.
Exactly. And just like giving directions, effective prompt engineering involves understanding your audience. Who are you building this GPT for? What are their needs and expectations?
Yeah.
How can you tailor your instructions to elicit the most relevant and helpful responses?
Okay, I'm starting to see how prompt engineering can be both an art and a science, right? It's about combining technical know-how with a deep understanding of the user's perspective.
Absolutely. And the best part is it's a skill that you can develop over time with practice and experimentation. The more you experiment with different prompt formats and phrasing, the better you'll become at unlocking the full potential of your GPTs.
Well, I'm definitely going to need to add prompt engineering to my study list. It seems like a crucial piece of the puzzle for building like truly effective and user-friendly GPT applications.
You got it.
All right, so we've talked about schemas, testing, instructions, evaluation. It feels like we've kind of built this like solid foundation for understanding GPT actions before even cracking open the documentation.
That's exactly the goal.
Yeah.
Remember, The documentation itself is packed with details,
Right.
technical information,
Yeah.
but having this mental map before you dive in
Right.
can make the whole process much smoother and less intimidating.
Absolutely. It's like having a guidebook before visiting a new city.
Exactly.
You know the major landmarks, the neighborhoods, so you can explore with more confidence and purpose.
Exactly. And speaking of guides, don't forget about the OpenAI community forums.
Oh, right.
That's a fantastic resource for
Right.
asking questions, sharing your experiences, and
Mhm.
connecting with other developers who are on this journey with you.
So the forums are kind of like our virtual support group,
They are.
a place to commiserate over tricky bugs
Yes.
and celebrate our coding
You
triumphs.
got it. And you'll find a wealth of knowledge and insights there, from code
So,
snippets to troubleshooting tips.
so it's like having a collective brain trust at our fingertips.
It is.
Yeah, I can definitely see the value in tapping into that shared wisdom.
Absolutely. And speaking of wisdom, let's not forget the importance of continuously expanding our knowledge and understanding of the OpenAI platform.
Right.
The field of AI is constantly evolving, so it's crucial to stay up to date on new features, best practices, and
Mhm.
potential changes.
So how do we stay ahead of the curve in this ever-changing landscape?
The OpenAI documentation itself is a great starting point.
Okay.
They have a dedicated section for updates and new releases, so it's
Mhm.
worth checking back regularly.
So treating the documentation as like a living document, not just a static reference manual.
Exactly.
Okay, what else can we do to stay in the loop?
Engaging with the broader OpenAI community can be really valuable.
Hmm.
Join online forums, attend webinars,
Okay.
participate in discussions, connect with other developers who are pushing the boundaries of what's possible.
The power of collective learning. I love that.
It is.
It feels like we're part of this larger movement.
Yeah.
A community of passionate individuals who are all working towards unlocking this incredible potential of AI.
Exactly. And by sharing our knowledge, experiences, and challenges, we can all learn and grow together.
Well, I'm feeling much more prepared to tackle the OpenAI documentation now.
Good,
It
good.
feels like we've laid a solid foundation,
Yeah.
mapped out the key landmarks so I can explore with more confidence and purpose.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, the journey of learning and exploring GPT actions is an ongoing one.
Hmm.
Don't be afraid to experiment, ask questions, and embrace the challenges along the way.
Right.
That's how you truly unlock the power of this incredible technology.
I'm definitely feeling inspired to dive in and start building.
Good.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on one more topic. The ethical considerations surrounding the development and deployment of GPTs and other AI technologies. It
Sure.
seems like a crucial aspect to address, especially as these systems become increasingly powerful.
And integrated into our lives.
You're absolutely right. As we unlock these ever more sophisticated capabilities within AI,
Yeah.
it's essential that we engage in thoughtful and responsible conversations about the potential impact of these technologies on individuals, society, and the world at large.
So it's not just about the technical advancements, it's about the human implications.
Exactly.
Right? Considering the potential benefits and risks of AI.
Right.
And ensuring that we're developing and deploying these technologies in a way that aligns with our values and our aspirations.
Precisely. And this is where the concept of responsible AI comes into play.
Okay.
It's a framework for guiding the development and use of AI in a way that prioritizes human well-being, fairness, transparency, and accountability.
So it's about building AI systems that are not only intelligent, but also ethical,
Yes.
and beneficial to all.
Exactly. And responsible AI is not just this theoretical concept.
It's a call to action for all of us involved in the development, deployment, and use of these technologies. It's about asking ourselves tough questions, considering the potential consequences of our work,
Yeah.
and striving to create AI systems that reflect our shared values and contribute to a better future for all.
That's a powerful message. It's a reminder that we have a responsibility to use these incredible tools wisely
Yeah,
and to ensure that AI serves humanity rather than the other way around.
absolutely. And responsible AI is not a destination.
Right.
It's a journey, an ongoing process of learning, reflection, and adaptation as we navigate the evolving landscape of AI and its impact on the world.
Well, I'm feeling incredibly inspired to learn more about the principles of responsible AI
Good.
and ensure that my work aligns with these important considerations.
That's the spirit.
Yeah.
And remember, the OpenAI documentation and community forums are great resources for staying informed about the latest developments and best practices in responsible AI.
Fantastic. I'll definitely be checking those out. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to embrace the challenge, dive into the documentation, and start building amazing, responsible GPT-powered applications.
Yes,
The possibilities are truly limitless.
they are.
Okay, I'm feeling pumped to actually start building something, but the sheer volume of information in the OpenAI documentation can be a bit overwhelming. Like, where do I even begin once I open those docs?
You're right. It's a lot to take in. I think one of the most helpful things is to understand the structure of the documentation itself. It's designed to be modular, so you can jump to the specific sections that you need without having to read everything cover to cover.
Okay, so it's not like a novel where I have to start on page 1 and read all the way through to the end.
Exactly. Think of it more like a choose-your-own-adventure book.
Okay.
I can start with the section on UP2 actions, for example, and then follow the links to other relevant sections as you need them.
Okay, that's a relief. I was a little worried about getting, like, bogged down into relevant details. So let's say I'm specifically interested in building that weather forecast GPT we talked about earlier. What sections of the documentation should I be focusing on?
You definitely want to start with the GPT actions section. This will give you that high-level overview of the concept and walk you through the basic steps involved.
Okay, and once I have that foundation, where do I go from there?
Next stop would be the API reference section. This is where you'll find all the nitty-gritty details about each API endpoint, including the parameters that you can use and the data you can expect to receive.
So this is where I'd actually learn, like, how to communicate with the weather API
Yes.
and extract the specific data that I need for my GPT.
You got it. And here's a pro tip. Pay close attention to the code examples that are provided in the documentation. These can be super helpful for understanding how to use the API in practice and can save you a lot of time and effort.
Yeah, code examples are lifesavers. I definitely learn best by seeing, like, how things actually work in action.
Absolutely. And don't hesitate to copy and paste those code examples into your own project and experiment with them.
Hmm.
The more you play around with the code, the better you'll understand how it all works.
Okay, so we've got GPT actions and API reference. Any other essential sections that I should be aware of?
If you're dealing with authentication, you'll definitely want to check out the authentication section.
Right.
That will guide you through the process of setting up secure communication between your GPT and the API.
Right. We touched on authentication earlier. It's like, that digital handshake.
It
Make
is.
sure my GPT has permission to access the API's data.
Exactly. And the documentation walks you through different authentication methods, like
Mhm.
API keys and OAuth,
Okay.
and provides clear instructions on how to implement them.
Okay. So far, we've got GPT actions, API reference, authentication. It sounds like there's a pretty logical flow to navigating the documentation. Is that by design?
Absolutely. The OpenAI team has put a lot of thought into structuring the documentation in a way that makes sense for developers. They want you to be successful, and they've designed the documentation to be your guide every step of the way.
Well, that's reassuring. I'm definitely starting to feel a lot less intimidated by the documentation now.
Good.
And I know that if I ever get stuck or have a question, we talked about those OpenAI community forums earlier, right? Like
Right.
our virtual help desk, a
Yes,
place to connect with other developers and tap into that, like, collective wisdom.
exactly. And you'll find that many developers have encountered those same challenges,
Right.
and they're often happy to share their solutions or offer helpful tips.
It's amazing how much we can learn from each other when we, like, share our experiences and knowledge.
Absolutely. Speaking of learning, let's talk about a concept that's essential for understand the inner workings of GPT models,
Okay.
the idea of attention.
Attention.
All right.
Oh, okay. That sounds intriguing, but also a bit abstract.
It is.
How does it actually relate to building custom GPTs?
It's actually the secret sauce that allows GPT models to process and generate text so effectively. It's a mechanism that enables the model to focus on specific parts of the input text and give them more weight in determining the output.
So, like, shining a spotlight on certain words or phrases
Yes.
to highlight their importance in, like, the overall context of the text.
Exactly. Imagine you're reading a sentence like, "The cat sat on the mat, but it was not happy."
Okay.
The word "it" refers back to the cat, right? But how does the model know that? It's through attention.
Oh, okay.
The attention mechanism allows the model to connect that pronoun "it"
Hmm.
with the noun "cat" and understand that they're referring to the same entity.
That's a great example. It's like the model is like drawing arrows between words, creating this web of connections
Yeah,
that helps it understand the relationships and dependencies within the text.
precisely. And this ability to track relationships and dependencies is crucial for things like language translation, text summarization, question answering, where understanding the context and the meaning of the text is paramount.
So attention is kind of like the glue that holds the meaning together.
Yeah,
It allows the model to make sense of the text as a whole,
it does.
rather than just processing it, like
Yeah,
word by word.
that's a great way to put it. And while the technical details of attention can get pretty complex, the basic concept is relatively straightforward. It's about selectively focusing on certain parts of the input to better understand the overall meaning and context.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like giving the model a magnifying glass, basically,
Yeah.
allowing it to zoom in on the most important details and extract the relevant information.
Exactly. And while attention might seem like a behind-the-scenes mechanism,
Right.
it has some profound implications for how we interact with and utilize GPT models.
Mm.
For example, understanding attention can help us craft those more effective prompts, interpret the model's responses more accurately, and even troubleshoot issues where the model seems to be misinterpreting the input or generating like nonsensical output.
Okay, so attention isn't just this theoretical concept.
Right.
It has very real-world applications for building and working with GPTs.
Absolutely. And as you dive deeper into the world of GPT development,
Mm.
you'll find that attention plays a central role in many of those advanced techniques and applications,
Okay.
from fine-tuning models for specific tasks to building those more complex and sophisticated AI systems.
Well, I'm definitely going to be paying more attention to attention from now on.
Good, good.
Seems like a pretty fundamental concept for understanding how these models work and how
Yes.
we can get the best results from them.
Exactly. And remember, the OpenAI documentation has a whole section dedicated to explaining attention in more detail.
Okay.
So be sure to check that out when you're ready to dive in.
Okay, attention section added to my reading list. Speaking of reading, I think it's time to actually take a look at some specific examples of how to work with the OpenAI documentation. You mentioned earlier that the documentation is full of, like, helpful code examples.
Yes.
Can we walk through a few of those to see how they can be applied in practice?
Absolutely. Let's jump right in.
Okay, I'm ready to see those code examples in action. Where should we start?
Let's revisit that weather forecast GPT that we discussed earlier.
Okay.
A common task you might want to perform is fetching the current weather conditions for a specific location.
Okay.
And the OpenAI documentation actually provides a clear example of how to do this using the National Weather Service API.
Perfect. I'm following along in the API reference section of the documentation right now, and I see the code example for fetching current weather conditions. It looks like it involves using the station's endpoint.
Exactly.
Oh.
The station's endpoint allows you to retrieve information about weather stations near a given latitude and longitude. And the code example demonstrates how to construct an API call to this endpoint using Python's requests library.
I see. So the code first imports the requests library.
Yes.
Then it defines the base URL for the API,
Right.
followed by the specific endpoint that we're targeting.
That's right. And then it defines the latitude and longitude for the location that we're interested in.
Okay, and then it uses the request.get method to send a getTeek request to the API,
Yes.
combining the base URL,
Right.
endpoint, and latitude-longitude parameter.
You got it. And the response from the API is stored in a variable called response.
Okay.
The code then checks the status code of the response to make sure that the request was successful.
Okay, and if that status code is 200, which indicates success,
Yes.
the code uses the JSON method to parse the response data into a JSON object.
Exactly. And then you can access the specific weather data that you're interested in from that JSON object.
This is making a lot more sense now that I can actually see how the code is structured and how it interacts with the API. It's like all those puzzle pieces are finally starting to click into place.
That's great to hear. And remember, this is just one example of how to use the OpenAI documentation and the code examples it provides. The beauty of these examples is that you can adapt and modify them to fit your specific needs, and you can build upon them to create more complex and sophisticated applications.
I love that. So it's not just about memorizing code, it's about understanding like the underlying concepts and applying them creatively.
Exactly. And that's what makes working with GPTs and the OpenAI API so exciting. There's just so much room for experimentation, discovery, and innovation.
Yeah, I'm definitely feeling that sense of excitement. It feels like we've like demystified the OpenAI
Mhm.
documentation
Yeah,
and transformed it from like this daunting obstacle into a valuable resource for unlocking the power of GPTs.
that's fantastic to hear. And remember, that OpenAI community is there to support you every step of the way.
Speaking of support, let's talk about a feature in the OpenAI platform that's specifically designed to help us troubleshoot our custom GPTs,
Yeah,
the test button.
absolutely. The test button is an incredibly valuable tool for developers, especially when you're first starting out with GPT actions.
Okay.
It allows you to test your custom GPT's functionality in a safe and controlled environment before you deploy it to the real world.
So it's like a mini testing ground where
Yes.
we can experiment
Oh,
and make sure everything's working as expected.
exactly. And the best part is it's super easy to use. Once you've added your OpenAPI schema,
Okay.
written your custom GPT's instructions,
Yeah.
you'll see a test button next to each action that you've defined.
Okay, so clicking that button allows us to see like the input and output
Yes.
of each API call, right?
Yeah.
So we can get this clear picture of what's happening behind the scenes.
Precisely. You can input sample data, trigger the action, and observe the response in real time. This allows you to verify that your GPT is calling the correct API endpoint, using the correct parameters, and returning the expected data.
So it's like having X-ray vision into the like inner workings
Yeah.
of our custom GPT, right?
Yeah.
We can actually spot any glitches or inconsistencies
Yes.
before they become major problems.
That's a great analogy. And here's a pro tip for using the test button effectively. Don't just test what we call the happy path, the scenario where everything works perfectly.
Right.
Try to anticipate those potential edge cases and error conditions
Okay.
and test how your GPT handles those situations.
So it's about testing for both success and failure,
Yes.
making sure our custom GPT is robust enough to handle like whatever the user throws at it.
Exactly. And by thoroughly testing your GPT using that test button, you can ensure that it's functioning correctly and providing that seamless user experience, even in those unexpected situations.
The test button sounds like a lifesaver. It's like having a safety net for our code, right? Catching those potential errors before they cause any like real damage.
You got it. And speaking of safety nets, let's not forget about the importance of error handling.
Error handling, we touched on that earlier. It's about anticipating potential problems, building in safeguards
Yeah.
to prevent our application from crashing
Yes.
or our users from getting frustrated.
Precisely. And while the test button can help us identify and fix errors during development, error handling is about gracefully handling those errors that might slip through the cracks and occur in the real world.
So it's about having like a backup plan, right?
Yes.
A way to like recover gracefully
Right.
and provide a positive user experience
Yeah.
even when things go wrong.
Exactly. And error handling is not just about preventing crashes, it's also about providing that helpful and informative feedback to the user.
Right. We talked about the importance of user-friendly error messages.
Yes.
Instead of just displaying like a cryptic error code,
Right.
we can provide those clear explanations and suggestions for resolving the issue.
You got it. A well-crafted error message can actually turn a potentially frustrating experience into a smooth and even helpful one.
So it's about turning like a stumbling block into a stepping stone,
Yes.
using errors as opportunities to enhance the user experience.
Exactly. And remember, error handling is an ongoing process. As you test and refine your custom GBT, you'll inevitably discover new edge cases and potential points of failure.
Right.
By embracing error handling as an integral part of your development workflow, you'll create applications that are not only functional, but also resilient and user-friendly.
Okay, so I'm seeing a pattern here, right? Testing helps us catch those errors early on,
Right.
and error handling is our safety net
Yes.
for gracefully handling the ones that slip through the cracks.
Exactly.
It's like this like dynamic duo working together to ensure that smooth and enjoyable user experience.
That's a great way to put it. And as you get more experience with GPT actions and building custom GPTs, you'll develop that deeper understanding of the different types of errors that can occur.
Yeah.
And the most effective strategies for handling them.
Yeah, I'm definitely looking forward to developing that expertise.
Yeah.
It feels like we're like moving beyond just coding, right?
Yeah.
Towards this deeper understanding of how to actually build like reliable,
Yeah.
user-centric applications.
You're absolutely right. And that's what makes this journey so rewarding. It's not just about writing code, it's about building solutions that solve real-world problems and enhance people's lives.
I'm feeling incredibly energized and inspired to keep exploring the world of GPT actions.
Good, good.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive,
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts on one more topic that can be a bit intimidating for beginners: the OpenAI API reference documentation.
You're right. It can seem a little daunting at first glance.
Yeah.
But don't worry. It's designed to be your comprehensive guide to all the tools and functionalities available
Hmm.
within the OpenAI platform. Think of it like this detailed blueprint, you know? It guides you through all the intricate workings of the platform and its various components.
So it's where I'd go to learn about like specific API endpoints,
Yes.
parameters,
Right.
and all the like technical nitty-gritty.
Exactly. Whether you're trying to understand the nuances of a particular API endpoint, explore the available parameters for customizing your GPT's behavior, or just seeking inspiration for new functionalities to integrate into your application, the API reference documentation is your go-to resource.
Okay, that sounds incredibly useful. But how do I even like approach such a dense document? Is there a specific strategy for navigating it effectively?
Absolutely. The good news is the OpenAI API reference documentation is incredibly well structured and searchable.
Okay.
You can browse by category, you can search for specific keywords, or even jump directly to the documentation for a particular API endpoint.
So it's like having this powerful search engine at our fingertips,
It is.
allowing us to quickly locate like the precise information we need to move forward.
Exactly. And here's a helpful tip. When you're using the API reference documentation, don't just skim the surface. Take some time to really delve into the details. The parameter descriptions, the code examples, the usage guidelines.
Yeah.
You might discover those hidden gems, functionalities or parameters that you weren't even aware of, that can significantly enhance your application's capabilities or streamline your development process.
So it's about going beyond like the headlines and really immersing ourselves in the nuances of each API endpoint and its associated functionalities.
Precisely. The API reference documentation is a treasure trove of technical details.
Right.
And the more time you spend exploring it, the better equipped you'll be to build those powerful and innovative GPT-powered applications.
I'm starting to see the API reference documentation as more than just a technical manual, right? It's like a source of inspiration,
It is.
a catalyst for creativity.
Exactly. And remember, experimentation is key. Don't be afraid to try out different parameters, explore those alternative API endpoints, and see how they impact your GPT's behavior.
Yeah.
The more you experiment, the better you'll understand the full range of possibilities that are available to you.
It sounds like a playground for developers.
It is.
You know, it's where we can experiment, explore, and push the boundaries of what's possible with GPTs.
Exactly. And remember, the OpenAI community is always there to support you
Right.
on this journey.
Hmm.
If you have a question or you encounter a roadblock, don't hesitate to reach out for help.
Okay, I'm feeling much more confident about tackling the API reference documentation now. It feels like we've like uncovered its hidden treasures and transformed it from this daunting obstacle into a valuable resource
So,
for unlocking the like full potential of GPTs.
that's wonderful to hear. And remember, the OpenAI documentation is constantly evolving and improving.
Right.
So be sure to check back regularly for updates and new features.
Yeah, I'll definitely be keeping an eye out for those updates. Speaking of updates, I've been hearing a lot of buzz lately about something called multimodal AI, and I'm curious to know how this might relate to our work with GPTs and OpenAI.
That's a great question. Multimodal AI is definitely one of the hottest trends in the field right now. And it really has the potential to revolutionize how we interact with and utilize AI systems. Essentially, multimodal AI refers to AI systems that can process and understand information from multiple modalities. So text, images, audio, video.
Okay, so instead of just feeding our GPTs like text-based prompts,
Right.
we could potentially incorporate like images, sounds, or even like video clips into the mix.
Exactly. Imagine being able to ask a GPT to generate a story based on an image that you provide, or to compose a piece of music inspired by a video clip.
Wow.
Multimodal AI has the potential to unlock some incredibly creative and innovative applications across a wide range of fields, from art and entertainment to education and scientific research.
That's mind-blowing. It's like giving our GPTs like a whole new set of senses,
Yeah.
allowing them to like perceive and understand the world in a much richer and more nuanced way.
Precisely. And while multimodal AI is still in its early stages of development, OpenAI is already making some significant strides in this area. They've recently released models that can generate images from text descriptions, answer questions about images, and even translate between different modalities,
Hmm.
like converting text to speech or vice versa.
That's incredible. It seems like the boundaries between different forms of media are blurring, and
Yeah.
AI is playing this key role in this convergence. I can't wait to see how these developments unfold
Yeah.
and what new creative possibilities emerge.
Me too. And it's really exciting to think about how these advancements in multimodal AI might intersect with our work with GPT actions. Imagine being able to create custom GPTs that can interact with the world in a much richer and more immersive way, processing information from multiple sources and generating outputs that span those different modalities.
That's a truly tantalizing vision. It's like we're on the cusp of a new era of AI,
Yeah,
one where the boundaries between the digital and the physical worlds
right.
become increasingly fluid and interactive.
Exactly. And while there are certainly challenges to navigate as we venture into this uncharted territory, the potential benefits are just immense. Multimodal AI really has the power to transform how we learn, create, communicate, and experience the world around us.
Well, I'm feeling incredibly inspired to dive deeper into this world of multimodal AI
Yeah.
and explore how it can enhance my work with GPTs and OpenAI.
Good, good.
It seems like there's a whole universe of possibilities just waiting to be discovered.
Absolutely. And remember, the OpenAI documentation and community forums are fantastic resources for staying up to date on the latest developments in multimodal AI
Mm.
and learning from other developers who are exploring this exciting new frontier.
Yeah, I'm definitely going to be spending some quality time with those resources. Speaking of resources, I think it's time to recap some of the key takeaways. From our deep dive into the OpenAI documentation for Python beginners,
Sure.
what are some of the essential like insights you'd like our listeners to remember
Hmm.
as they embark on their own GPT action adventures?
That's a great question. I'd say the most important takeaway is to approach the OpenAI documentation with a mindset of curiosity and exploration.
Hmm.
Don't be intimidated by the technical details or the jargon. The documentation is incredibly well written,
Yeah,
packed with those helpful examples and explanations that can guide you through the process.
right. It's like having this friendly guide leading us through the sometimes complex world of GPT development.
Yeah.
Right. Pointing out the landmarks, explaining the intricacies along the way.
Exactly. And another key takeaway is to really embrace experimentation as
Mhm.
part of your learning process. Don't be afraid to try new things, break things, and learn from your mistakes.
Right.
The OpenAI platform provides that safe and supportive environment for exploring those different approaches and discovering what works best for you.
The joy of learning by doing that.
It is.
It's about transforming the OpenAI platform into our own personal playground for experimentation and innovation.
Precisely. And a final takeaway I want to emphasize is the importance of community.
Right.
The OpenAI community forums are an incredible resource for connecting with other developers,
Hmm.
asking questions, sharing those insights, and finding inspiration for new projects. Don't underestimate the power of collaboration and collective learning.
Yeah, the power of shared knowledge and collective wisdom.
Yes.
It's a reminder that we're all on this journey together,
Yeah,
and we can achieve some incredible things when we support and learn from each other.
absolutely. And as you continue your exploration of the OpenAI documentation and the world of GPT actions,
Hmm.
remember that we're here to support you every step of the way.
Right.
So go forth, experiment, create, and have fun unlocking the incredible power of GPTs.
Those are some fantastic parting words of wisdom. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to embrace the challenge, dive into the documentation, and start building those amazing GPT-powered applications. The possibilities are truly limitless, and we can't wait to see what you create. Until next time, happy coding, everyone.
Ah, the joy of learning by doing right. It's about transforming the OpenAI platform into our own personal playground for experimentation and innovation.
Precisely. And a final takeaway I want to emphasize is the importance of community. The OpenAI community forums are an incredible resource for connecting with other developers, asking questions, sharing insights, and finding inspiration for new projects. Don't underestimate the power of collaboration and collective learning.
The power of shared knowledge and collective wisdom, right? It's a reminder that we're all in this journey together, and we can achieve some incredible things when we support and learn from each other. Absolutely. And as you continue your exploration of the OpenAI documentation and the world of GPT actions, remember that we're here to support you every step of the way. So go forth, experiment, create, and have fun unlocking the incredible power of GPTs.
Those are some fantastic parting words of wisdom. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to embrace the challenge, dive into the documentation, and start building those amazing GPT-powered applications. The possibilities are truly limitless, and we can't wait to see what you create. Until next time, happy coding, everyone. Okay, so have you ever tried to, really dig into the OpenAI documentation?
Yeah.
It can be a little overwhelming, right?
Yeah, especially if you're new.
Especially if you're newer to Python and you know you've only got a couple months under your belt. It can be intimidating to try and figure out where to even start.
Absolutely.
We're going to give you a mental roadmap today,
Yeah,
specifically for the GPT Actions library.
absolutely.
So that way when you open those docs, you know exactly kind of where to go, what to do, what to look for.
Yeah, the goal is to make you feel confident and comfortable diving into those docs.
Yes, exactly. And, instead of just feeling that total confusion and overwhelm.
Right.
So let's break down what I is this GPT Actions library thing. I'm picturing a giant library with actions in it. Is that right?
I love that visual. I mean, it's not a physical library, but it's a library of pre-built tools to help you connect GPT to different applications. So let's say you want to use GPT to analyze some customer data that's sitting in your database. And then you want to automatically send a summary of that to your team on Slack.
Right.
Now, you could code all of that from scratch, or you could use the GPT Actions library, which has pre-built functions that will do a lot of that heavy lifting for you.
That sounds very cool. But so, again, I'm thinking about that person who's only been coding for a couple months,
Right.
3 months, let's say, in Python. Are they going to be able to use this library? Is it the right starting place for them?
Absolutely. So anyone with a basic understanding of Python can use this library. You'll need to be comfortable with making API calls, which is basically just sending a request to a website. Like, hey, Google, show me results for Python tutorials. But here's a pro tip. If you get stuck, ChatGPT can actually help you debug your code.
Oh, nice. Okay, so that's a good little tool.
Yeah, definitely. And OpenAI also has what they call the cookbook, which is full of real-world examples and guides for using GPT actions with different applications and middleware.
Middleware. Okay, so that's another word that might sound a little intimidating.
Right.
What even is that?
So imagine you're at a fancy restaurant. You tell the waiter what you want. But the chef in the back speaks a completely different language. Middleware is like that waiter. It translates your order, which comes from GPT, into something that the kitchen or the other applications can understand. It can format data, connect to different systems, even ones that don't speak HTTP, like databases.
So it's like a bridge almost.
Exactly, yeah.
Yeah.
A universal translator between all these different applications.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. And you mentioned that the cookbook has resources for middleware.
It does. There are specific cookbooks for working with third-party actions and middleware. They even have examples for cloud platforms like Azure, GCP, and AWS. So you can see how professionals are using this stuff in real-world projects. And the best part is you can actually contribute to the cookbook. It's open source, which means you can suggest changes or report errors.
Okay, wait, hold on. Contribute. Now, if I'm a beginner and I'm just trying to figure this stuff out,
Right.
should I be trying to contribute to this already?
You definitely don't have to contribute. At this stage, focus on using the cookbook as a learning tool. Just explore the examples, see how things connect. It's like having a guided tour through the GPT actions jungle before you set off on your own.
I like that. That makes me feel better because I don't think I'm ready to be adding to the wealth of knowledge quite yet.
Right.
Okay, so, we want to be realistic too about this. Are there any limitations with this library or things that, I should be aware of as I'm going into this? Should I set my expectations low or how should I be thinking about this?
Yeah, it's good to be realistic.
Yeah.
So one thing to keep in mind is that OpenAI doesn't control the APIs of other applications. So things can change on their end.
Oh.
And that might affect how your GPT actions work. The library is a fantastic starting point, but you might need to adapt as you go. And if you're not super comfortable with coding yet, some parts of it might feel a little challenging. But hey, that's where the fun lies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You gotta have a little challenge to keep it interesting. So okay, so just to recap, the GPT Actions library,
Yeah.
amazing toolkit. The cookbook, my friendly guide that's given me all the recipes and tips and tricks I need. What else should I know as I'm getting ready to explore the OpenAI documentation in general?
So now that you have the lay of the land, I'd say dive into the documentation and consider building your own GPT action. Think about what unique integration you could create, maybe something that combines your favorite
Uh,
apps or automates a task you find tedious.
Okay, challenge accepted. And to all of our listeners out there, remember, you don't have to be an expert to navigate this OpenAI documentation. With a
Right.
little guidance, with the right resources,
Mhm.
you can build some really cool things.
Yeah.
Happy exploring, everyone.
Have fun.
Yeah.
Bye.
All right, so you're ready to start building with OpenAI, but the documentation feels a bit like a jungle, right? It's dense, there are a lot of technical terms, and you're not even sure where to begin. We're here to help you navigate all of that.
You're absolutely right. The documentation can be overwhelming at first, especially when you're just getting started with Python. We're going to break down the essential parts specifically around GPT actions and authentication so that you can approach it with confidence.
Okay, cool. You've been coding for about 3 months now, so you're not a complete beginner, but you're still finding your footing. Let's start by thinking about how OpenAI is structured. Have you ever used like a banking app or website?
Yeah, I think most of us have at this point.
Exactly. And a lot of the concepts you see in online banking are similar to how OpenAI works. Think about it. You log in with your credentials, and then you can do things like check your balance, transfer money, or pay bills. Each of these actions requires different levels of security and authorization.
That's a great analogy. So in the case of OpenAI, instead of banking actions, you're performing actions with GPT, their powerful language model. And just like with your bank, there are different ways to authenticate yourself and authorize those actions.
Right. So when we talk about authentication, the OpenAI documentation, it's essentially about verifying who you are and what you're allowed to do. It's like the bank making sure you're really you before letting you transfer money.
Exactly. And there are a few different methods OpenAI uses for authentication, each with its own level of security and complexity. Let's start with the simplest one, none.
None. So I don't need any credentials at all. It's like walking in the bank and getting free candy at the counter.
Well, not exactly free candy, but you've got the right idea. Sometimes for very basic tasks or initial interactions, OpenAI doesn't require any authentication. This is great for things like simple prompts or testing out the API without having to jump through hoops.
Gotcha. So none is for when I just want to get a taste of what OpenAI can do. But what if I want to start building something more substantial?
Then you'll need to step up your security game. The next level is using an API key. This is like your unique identifier that lets OpenAI know who's making the request. It's like having a debit card for specific transactions.
So it's more secure than none, but how do I actually get this API key?
You can generate it directly within your OpenAI account settings. It's usually a long, random string of characters that you'll need to keep secret, just like your bank PIN.
Makes sense. I'm guessing this is the most common method developers use.
It's definitely very popular, especially for applications where you need to control access to your API usage. But there's one more method that's even more secure and offers more advanced capabilities. Oath.
Oof. I've seen that term before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means. Is it like the super secure vault at the bank?
You could think of it that way. Oath allows users to log in with their existing accounts from other providers like Google or Facebook. It's a way of delegating authorization without having to share your actual OpenAI credentials.
So it's like giving someone limited access to my bank account without giving them my PIN.
That's a good way to put it. Oath is all about granting specific permissions to third-party applications. It's what allows you to do things like log in to a website using your Google account without having to create a new username and password.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
But I imagine setting up Oath is a bit more complicated than just using an API key.
It does involve a few more steps,
Yeah.
but the OpenAI documentation provides a clear guide on how to implement it. You'll essentially need to register your application with OpenAI, obtain a client ID and client secret, and then set up a specific flow for authorization and token exchange. Don't worry, we'll break down those steps a bit later on.
So we've got 3 main authentication methods. None for basic interactions, API key for more secure access, and Oath for advanced functionality and user logins. It sounds like each method has its own use cases, and choosing the right one depends on what you're building.
Precisely. It's all about finding the right balance between security and convenience. And as you gain more experience with OpenAI, we'll develop a better understanding of when to use each method.
Speaking of gaining experience, let's dive a bit deeper into how these methods work in practice.
Yeah.
Can you give us a real-world example of when a developer might choose to use an API key instead of none?
Absolutely. Let's say you're building an application that uses GPT to generate personalized product recommendations for users. You'll want to keep your API usage secure and prevent unauthorized access. In this case, using an API key would be a wise choice.
That makes sense. It's like giving each employee their own key to access specific areas of the bank. But what about Oath? When would I use that instead of an API key?
Oath shines when you need users to log in with their existing accounts and grant your application access to their OpenAI resources. For instance, imagine you're creating a writing assistant that integrates with OpenAI. Using Oathos, users could seamlessly connect their Google accounts, allowing your application to access their GPT usage and personalize the writing experience.
So it's not just about security, it's also about creating a more seamless and integrated experience for users. And I'm guessing Oath is essential for applications that involve sensitive user data.
Absolutely. Anytime you're dealing with user information, you want to ensure the highest level of security and privacy. Oath helps achieve that by handling user authentication and authorization through trusted third-party providers.
Okay, this is all starting to click into place. We've got the what of authentication, but now I'm curious about the how. Let's start with API keys. You mentioned that I need to generate one in my OpenAI account. Where do I go from there?
Once you have your API key, you'll need to include it in your code when making requests to the OpenAI API. The documentation provides clear instructions on how to do this for different programming languages, including Python.
So it's basically like inserting your debit card into the ATM before making a transaction. But what about OAuth? That sounds a bit more complex. Can you walk us through the basic steps involved?
Sure. As I mentioned earlier with OAuth, you first need to register your application with OpenAI. This involves providing some basic information about your app and setting up redirect URLs, which are essentially the addresses OpenAI will use to send users back to your application after they've authorized access.
So it's like setting up a secure pathway between my application and OpenAI. What happens after I register my application?
OpenAI will provide you with a client ID and client secret. These are like your application's unique identifiers that you'll use to initiate the OAuth flow. You'll then need to implement the authorization process, which involves redirecting users to an OpenAI authorization page where they can grant your app access to their account.
Okay, so it's like taking the user to a special section of the bank where they can authorize specific transactions. What happens after they grant permission?
OpenAI will redirect the user back to your application along with an authorization code. You'll then exchange this code for an access token, which is like a temporary pass that allows your application to make requests on behalf of the user.
So it's like getting a special token after going through security at the bank.
Yeah,
And I'm guessing this access token expires after a certain amount of time.
exactly. Access tokens have a limited lifespan for security reasons. Once it expires, you'll need to refresh it using a refresh token, which is also provided during the initial authorization process.
Okay, so there's a whole system for managing these tokens and ensuring that everything stays secure. It definitely sounds more involved than using an API key, but I can see how it's necessary for more complex applications, especially those that deal with user data.
You're right. OAuth provides a robust and standardized way to handle authentication and authorization in a secure and user-friendly manner. It might seem a bit daunting at first, but once you understand the basic flow, it becomes much easier to implement. And the OpenAI documentation does a great job of guiding you through the process step by step.
This has been incredibly helpful in demystifying the whole authentication landscape in OpenAI. We've gone from feeling lost in the jungle to having a clearer map of the terrain. But I have a feeling there's even more to explore.
You're absolutely right. We've only scratched the surface of what OpenAI has to offer. But now that you have a solid understanding of authentication, you're well equipped to dive deeper into the documentation and start building amazing things.
And speaking of diving deeper, I'm curious about some of the common challenges developers face with authentication, especially when it comes to troubleshooting issues. Is there anything we should be aware of?
That's a great question. One of the most common issues developers encounter is incorrect API key usage. It's crucial to ensure that you're using the correct key for the specific OpenAI service you're trying to access. The documentation provides clear instructions on how to obtain and manage your API keys, so it's always a good idea to double-check those steps.
It's like making sure you're using the right debit card for the right account. And what about OAuth? Are there any common pitfalls there?
With OAuth, one of the trickiest parts can be setting up the redirect URLs correctly. These URLs need to match exactly what you've configured in your OpenAI application settings. Even a small typo can cause the authorization flow to break down. Fortunately, the OpenAI documentation provides detailed examples and troubleshooting tips to help you get it right.
So it's like making sure the pathway between your application and OpenAI is perfectly aligned. Any other tips for troubleshooting authentication issues?
One of the most valuable resources is the OpenAI Community Forum. It's a great place to ask questions, share your experiences, and get help from other developers who have encountered similar challenges. Don't be afraid to reach out for support. You're not alone in this journey.
That's a great reminder. The OpenAI community is a fantastic resource for learning and problem solving. And I'm sure there are plenty of helpful tutorials and blog posts out there as well.
Absolutely. The OpenAI ecosystem is constantly evolving, and there are tons of resources available to help you stay up to date and overcome any obstacles you might encounter.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into OpenAI authentication. We've covered a lot of ground from the basic concepts to the practical steps involved in implementing each method. And most importantly, we've dispelled some of the mystery and confusion that often surrounds this topic.
I completely agree. Authentication is a fundamental aspect of working with OpenAI, and having a solid understanding of it empowers you to build secure and robust applications. And remember, the OpenAI documentation and community are your allies in this journey. Don't hesitate to explore, experiment, and ask for help along the way.
All right, so it sounds like we've laid a really solid foundation here.
Yeah, I think so.
But there's still so much more to uncover about the OpenAI world. We'll pick up this conversation in part 2, so stay tuned.
Yeah, I think so.
But there's still so much more to uncover about the OpenAI world.
Yeah.
As we've been talking, I keep thinking back to the OpenAI documentation itself. There's a specific section on GPT actions and authentication that I know some listeners might find intimidating.
Definitely. It's where all these concepts come together in a more technical way. But the good news is, once you understand the fundamentals we've discussed, that section becomes much easier to digest.
So if our listener were to open up that section right now,
Mhm.
what are some of the key things they should be looking for?
First, they'll see a breakdown of the different authentication methods we've discussed: none, API key, and oath. The documentation provides a concise description of each method and when you might choose one over the others.
Right, so it's like a quick reference guide to reinforce what we've already talked about.
Exactly. And then the documentation goes deeper into the technical details of each method. For example, in the API key section, they'll find instructions on how to generate and manage your API keys within your OpenAI account.
Okay, so it's like a step-by-step guide to getting your credentials set up.
Precisely. And for oath, the documentation walks you through the entire authorization flow, including how to register your application, obtain your client ID, and secret and handle token exchange.
It sounds like they've really tried to make it as straightforward as possible, even though it's dealing with some complex concepts.
They definitely have. The documentation includes code examples, diagrams, and even troubleshooting tips to help you along the way.
So it's not just about explaining what things are, it's also about showing you how to use them in practice.
Exactly. And one thing I really appreciate about the OpenAI documentation is that they don't assume you're a seasoned developer. They explain things in a way that's accessible to beginners while still providing enough depth for more experienced programmers.
That's so important. There's nothing more frustrating than trying to learn something new and feeling like the documentation is written in a foreign language.
I completely agree. And the OpenAI team has done a great job of striking that balance between clarity and comprehensiveness.
Yeah, totally. As we're talking about the documentation, I'm realizing that it's really like a living document. It's constantly being updated and improved as OpenAI evolves.
You're absolutely right. They're always adding new features, refining existing ones, and incorporating feedback from the developer community. So it's important to make checking for updates a regular part of your workflow.
That's a great point. And it speaks to the fact that learning to work with OpenAI is an ongoing journey. It's not about memorizing everything in the documentation. It's about developing a comfort level with exploring it and knowing where to find the information you need.
Exactly. It's like having a roadmap that guides you through the terrain even as the landscape changes.
And speaking of roadmaps, I think it would be helpful to zoom out a bit and talk about the bigger picture of working with OpenAI. We've focused a lot on authentication, but there's so much more to it than that.
You're right. Authentication is just the gateway. Once you're through that door, you have access to a whole world of powerful tools and capabilities.
So beyond authentication, what are some of the key areas that our listeners should be familiar with as they continue their OpenAI journey?
One of the most important concepts is understanding the different models and engines available within OpenAI. GPT is just one of many, and each model has its own strengths and weaknesses depending on the task you're trying to accomplish.
Right, so it's like choosing the right tool for the job.
Exactly. And the documentation provides a comprehensive overview of each model, along with guidelines on when to use them.
And once you've chosen your model, you need to understand how to interact with it through the API.
That's where the concept of prompts comes in. A prompt is essentially the input you give to the model, and it determines the output you receive.
So it's like giving the model instructions on what you want it to do.
Precisely. And crafting effective prompts is an art and a science. The documentation provides a wealth of information on prompt engineering techniques and best practices.
It sounds like there's a lot to learn, but also a lot of room for creativity and experimentation.
Absolutely. That's one of the things that makes working with OpenAI so exciting. It's constantly pushing the boundaries of what's possible with language models.
As we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier, the OpenAI community. Can you tell us a bit more about that and why it's such a valuable resource?
The OpenAI community is a vibrant and supportive group of developers, researchers, and enthusiasts who are passionate about pushing the boundaries of AI. They share their knowledge, collaborate on projects, and help each other overcome challenges.
It sounds like a great place to connect with like-minded individuals and learn from their experiences.
It definitely is. The community forum is a fantastic resource for asking questions, getting feedback on your work, and staying up to date on the latest developments in the OpenAI ecosystem.
And I imagine there are also opportunities to contribute to the community itself.
Absolutely. OpenAI encourages community involvement, whether it's through sharing code writing tutorials or simply participating in discussions. It's a great way to give back and help others learn and grow.
This has been such a helpful exploration of OpenAI and its documentation. We've covered a lot of ground from the nitty-gritty of authentication to the broader landscape of models, prompts, and community resources. I'm feeling much more confident about navigating this world now.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the OpenAI documentation is your constant companion on this journey. Don't be afraid to dive in, explore, and experiment. There's a whole universe of possibilities waiting to be discovered.
And with the guidance of the OpenAI community and resources like this deep dive, we can unlock those possibilities together. All right, well, I think this is a good place to pause for now.
Yeah, I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I want to make sure our listeners have time to process all this information before we move on.
Yeah, I agree.
We've covered a lot of ground, and I want to make sure our listeners have time to process all this information before we move on. You know, as we've been talking, I've been thinking about our listener who's been coding for 3 months. They've got the basics of Python down, but are now facing this whole new world of OpenAI.
Yeah, it's a big leap for sure. Going from writing simple scripts to interacting with these powerful language models can feel intimidating.
Exactly. So for our listener out there who's feeling that sense of what now, what advice would you give them? Where should they focus their energy as they start exploring the OpenAI documentation?
I'd say the first step is to solidify their understanding of the core concepts we've discussed today. Authentication is foundational. Make sure you feel comfortable with those different methods, why you choose one over another, and the basic steps involved.
So really nail down the getting in the door part.
Exactly. Once that feels solid, I'd recommend diving into the specific models and engines that are most relevant to their interests or the projects they want to build.
Right, because GPT is just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak.
Precisely. There's DELI for image generation, Whisper for speech recognition, and a whole suite of other models. Explore those, read the documentation, and start to understand their capabilities.
It's like browsing a menu of possibilities.
That's a great way to put it. And once you've got a sense of the models, start playing around with prompts. Experiment with different ways of instructing the models. See what kind of outputs you get and start to develop that intuition for how they work.
Because that's where the real magic happens, right? In that interaction between human intention and AI capability.
Absolutely. Prompt engineering is a crucial skill in this field, and the best way to learn is by doing. Don't be afraid to try things out, make mistakes, and learn from them.
That's such a key point. It's easy to get overwhelmed by the complexity, but at the end of the day, it's about exploration and experimentation.
Couldn't agree more. And don't forget the power of the community. There are so many resources out there, tutorials, blog posts, forums. If you get stuck or have a question, chances are someone else has already faced the same challenge and shared their solution.
It's like having a whole team of mentors and collaborators at your fingertips.
Exactly. So for our listener who's just starting out on this journey, my biggest piece of advice would be embrace the learning process. It's going to be a continuous journey of discovery, but it's also going to be incredibly rewarding.
Because we're really just scratching the surface of what's possible with AI, and it's only going to get more exciting from here.
Absolutely. And with the tools, resources, and community support available, there's no limit to what we can achieve.
Well said. I think we've given our listener a lot to chew on today. We've demystified the OpenAI documentation, broken down those key concepts, and given them a roadmap for their ongoing exploration.
And I hope we've also instilled a sense of excitement and possibility. This field is constantly evolving, and there's always something new to learn and explore.
So to our listener out there, we encourage you to dive in, embrace the challenge, and never stop learning. The world of OpenAI is waiting for you.
And who knows, maybe someday you'll be the one sharing your knowledge and inspiring others on their AI journeys.
That's a great thought to end on. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time, keep exploring and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with AI. All right, so you've been learning Python for, what, about 3 months now? And you're ready to start using the OpenAI API, specifically GPT actions. But those docs, they can be a little intimidating, right? I mean, I've been
Yeah.
coding for a while, and even I kind of get overwhelmed just looking at them sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, it's totally understandable. The OpenAI documentation, it's really comprehensive and it has a ton of technical details. That's kind of why we're here, right? We're here to break it down and help you build a mental roadmap before you dive in.
Yeah, think of this as your guide to the guide. Let's start with the fundamentals. What exactly are GPT actions, and why should a Python beginner be excited about them?
Yeah, so GPT actions are a way to connect your Python code directly to ChatGPT. And what that does is it makes your applications way more dynamic and interactive. So it goes beyond just conversation.
Mhm.
Now, ChatGPT can actually do things using your code.
Okay, so can you give me like a concrete example, something that a Python beginner can really wrap their head around?
Yeah, sure. So imagine you're building a to-do list app, right? With GPT actions, you could have ChatGPT actually add items to the list, mark them as complete, or even prioritize them based on what the user is saying. You're essentially teaching ChatGPT to work with the functionality of your app.
Okay, so it's not just ChatGPT talking about these tasks, it can actually execute them through my code.
That's exactly right. And that opens up a huge, huge range of possibilities, right? We'll explore some of those a little bit later on. But first, I think it makes sense to kind of get into some of the practical considerations for building with GPT Action.
Okay, cool. I'm looking at the production notes on GPT Actions document, and they talk a lot about rate limits, timeouts, TLS, and HTTPS, like all sorts of things that seem pretty technical. Why are these things so important?
So these are all super important for building an app that's both robust and secure. Let's start with rate limits. Imagine you have hundreds or thousands of users all trying to use your app at the same time, right? Rate limits, what they do is they help prevent your servers from getting overloaded, potentially crashing.
So it's kind of like a safety valve to prevent things from going totally crazy.
Yeah, that's a good way to think about it. And then timeouts serve a very similar purpose, right? They make sure that your application isn't just sitting there waiting indefinitely for a response from ChatGPT or from an external API. If a request takes too long, it's better to just time it out and then handle that error gracefully.
Right, so it's all about building in that resilience, making sure that things are running smoothly, even if there are maybe some unexpected delays or surges in traffic. What about TLS and HTTPS? Those sound pretty serious.
They are. So TLS, what that does is it encrypts the communication that's happening between your application and ChatGPT, so that protects sensitive information from being intercepted. It's kind of like sending a confidential message in a sealed envelope. Only the intended recipient can actually open it. HTTPS makes sure that you're actually using that secure connection.
Okay, so security is a top priority. Now, the document also mentions something called IP egress ranges. What are those, and how do they kind of fit into the security picture?
Yeah, so IP egress ranges are the specific IP addresses that ChatGPT is going to be using when it's talking to your application. And you can actually use this information to configure your firewall to only allow traffic from those IP addresses. It just adds that little extra layer of security.
Interesting. So it's like I'm creating a whitelist of trusted IPs and making sure that only ChatGPT can access my app.
That's right. It's all about implementing those security best practices, protecting your application, and protecting your users' data.
Okay, so we've covered some of those production considerations like rate limits, timeouts, and security. What's next on our roadmap for understanding GPT actions?
So next, I think it makes sense to talk about authentication. So this is how you control who can access your GPT actions and how they can actually use them.
All right, authentication, very important. The documentation mentions a bunch of different methods like OAuth and API keys. Can you break those down for me and maybe even connect them back to some of my Python knowledge?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've probably encountered API keys before, right? Even just in your Python journey. API keys are basically unique passwords for your application. It lets you control which other applications can talk to your API and what they can do. So it's like a key that unlocks certain functionality.
Okay, so like a special key that gives access to certain parts of my code. What about OAuth? I know that's used for like logging in with Google or Facebook.
Yeah, exactly. OAuth is a way to delegate access without sharing your actual password. So let's say you want users to be able to, I don't know, access their Google Calendar through your application. With OAuth, you can request specific permissions from Google, like the ability to read calendar events. And then Google will provide your application with this special token that grants those specific permissions, but you never have to actually handle the user's Google password directly.
So it's a more secure way to give limited access to specific parts of a user's data.
Exactly. And with GPT Actions, you can actually choose the authentication method that works best for you, right? You can even mix and match, use OAuth for some endpoints and API keys for others.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered production considerations and authentication. What else do we need to know to really unlock this OpenAI documentation?
So let's talk about the OpenAPI specification. This is a standardized way of describing your API, and it's super important in how ChatGPT understands your GPT actions and how it interacts with them.
All right, OpenAPI specification. This sounds important, but I'm looking at the documentation, and there are all sorts of rules and limitations when it comes to defining actions with the OpenAPI spec, like character limits, no custom headers, all sorts of things. It makes my head spin a little. Why so many restrictions?
Yeah, it might seem a little restrictive at first, but all of these constraints actually serve a really valuable purpose. What they do is they encourage you to be clear, concise, and consistent. And ultimately, what that does, it makes your API way easier to understand and use.
So it's like good coding practices, but
Yeah.
applied to API design.
Exactly. So, for example, there are character limits on how long your endpoint and parameter descriptions can be. And what that does is it forces you to be concise, to get straight to the point. And that benefits ChatGPT, but it also benefits any human developers that might be working with your API.
So it's not about being limited. It's about being focused.
Yeah.
Okay, I got it. Any other key things I should be aware of when it comes to the OpenAPI specification?
Yeah, so you'll notice you can't use custom headers. There are domain restrictions for Oath. Payloads can only be text. But I wouldn't worry too much about memorizing all the details right now. The important thing is to know that the OpenAI documentation provides really clear guidelines on how to structure your OpenAPI spec correctly.
So familiarize myself with the specific rules, the recommendations, before I start actually building out my GPT actions. Sounds like planning ahead and following these guidelines will save me some headaches later on.
Definitely. And as you get more experience with API development, all of these constraints are going to start to feel less like limitations and more like helpful guardrails that guide you toward building an API that's well structured and maintainable.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered production notes, authentication, and the OpenAPI specification. It feels like we're building a good foundation here for how to actually work with these GPT actions. What's next?
So next, I think it makes sense to talk about a key safety feature called the consequential flag.
Consequential flag. That sounds a little bit ominous. What is that?
Yeah, so remember how we were talking about GPT actions being able to take real-world actions, right? Like
Yeah.
adding an item to your to-do list. Well, some actions are more consequential than others. So, for example, booking a hotel room and charging someone's credit card, that's obviously a much more significant action than, say, adding an item to a to-do list.
Yeah, big difference in terms of impact.
Exactly. And the consequential flag, what it does is it helps developers and ChatGPT differentiate between these types of actions. So when an action is marked as consequential, ChatGPT will treat it more carefully, often prompting the user for confirmation before it actually goes ahead and does anything.
So it's like a safety net to prevent unintended consequences,
Did it?
especially when you're dealing with things that could have real-world financial or logistical implications.
Exactly. It just adds that extra layer of protection and ensures that the user is always in control and that actions are only performed with their consent.
That makes a lot of sense.
Exit.
It's good to know that there are mechanisms in place to prevent GPT actions from going rogue.
Right. Responsible AI development is all about building powerful tools, but making sure that they're used safely and ethically.
Well said. So we've covered production notes, authentication, the OpenAPI specification, consequential flag. Any other essential concepts we need to explore before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
Yeah, so I think now it makes sense to shift our focus to something a little more concrete. Best practices for providing examples to ChatGPT. These examples are super important in helping ChatGPT understand how to correctly use your API and how to respond to user requests in a way that's actually helpful and informative.
Examples are always good.
Uh-huh.
So I'm looking at the documentation, and it has a few what they call bad and good examples for instructions and descriptions. I'm a little curious why some examples are considered bad when it seems like they could be potentially helpful.
Yeah, so a lot of times those bad examples, what they do is they fall into the trap of being too prescriptive. So they try to micromanage ChatGPT and dictate exactly when it should use an action or exactly how it should respond to a user. But remember, ChatGPT is designed to be intelligent and to understand context. So we want to empower it to make decisions based on the user's input, not force it into these rigid patterns.
So give ChatGPT the freedom to do what it does best, understand natural language, respond in a human-like way.
Exactly. So, for example, a bad instruction might say something like, whenever the user mentions a task, ask if they would like to use the TGO action to add it to their to-do list. Right. That's way too specific. It doesn't give ChatGPT any room to make its own judgment. A good example would be something like, the to-do action can add, remove, and view items on a user's to-do list. So you give ChatGPT the information it needs without trying to control its every move.
So provide clear, concise information, but then trust ChatGPT to use that information intelligently.
Exactly. And the same principle applies to descriptions. Avoid trying to script ChatGPT's responses word for word. Just trust it to handle the conversational flow naturally.
So let ChatGPT be ChatGPT. Don't try to turn it into a puppet.
Exactly. Now, let's talk about another best practice. When you're designing your API responses, it's generally better to return raw data instead of nicely formatted, like human-readable responses.
Really, wouldn't it be more user-friendly to just provide responses that are already formatted in a way that's easy for the user to understand?
I mean, it might seem that way, but you have to remember that ChatGPT is actually the one who's crafting the final response that the user sees. And by returning raw data, what we're doing is we're giving ChatGPT the maximum flexibility in how it actually presents that information.
So it's like I'm giving ChatGPT the ingredients and then letting it decide how to bake the cake instead of handing it a pre-made cake that might not suit everyone's taste.
That is a perfect analogy. So, for example, instead of returning a response that says, you have 3 items on your to-do list, buy groceries, walk the dog, and pay the bills, you would just return a JSON object that contains that raw data. Todos, buy groceries, walk the dog, pay the bills.
Okay, so raw data gives ChatGPT more creative control over how to present the information to the user. It can adapt its response based on the context, the user's preferences, all sorts of factors.
Exactly. It's about empowering ChatGPT to deliver the best possible user experience.
This is all starting to make sense. So we've talked about best practices for providing instructions, descriptions, even how to structure those API responses. Anything else we should keep in mind when it comes to giving ChatGPT good examples?
Yeah, one more thing. When you're providing those examples, focus on demonstrating the core functionality of your API. Don't try to show every possible edge case or scenario.
So keep it simple. Focus on the most common use cases.
Exactly. You don't want to overwhelm ChatGPT with too much information or try to anticipate every possible user interaction.
Keep it simple. Let ChatGPT handle the nuances. This deep dive into examples has been super helpful. I feel like I'm really starting to understand how to effectively communicate with ChatGPT through my API.
That's fantastic. Remember, those examples are the bridge between your code and ChatGPT's understanding. And by mastering this art, you'll be able to unlock the true potential of GPT actions and build some really powerful and intuitive applications.
I'm definitely feeling inspired. So what's next? We've covered a lot of ground in this first part, but I'm eager to dive in even deeper.
So next, let's talk about something that's absolutely critical when you're building any application that interacts with users: data usage and responsible AI development.
Okay. Data privacy, security, definitely important topics. What should we be thinking about in the context of GPT actions?
So first and foremost, you need to be transparent with your users about how their data is being used. So the OpenAI documentation clearly states that GPT action data may be used to improve ChatGPT's overall capabilities. So that means that portions of the user's interactions with your action could be used to make ChatGPT better at understanding and responding to prompts.
That makes sense. ChatGPT is kind of learning from real-world usage to become more intelligent, more helpful. But how do we balance that with user privacy?
Yeah, so transparency is absolutely key here. If your GPT action collects or uses user data, be upfront about it. Provide clear and concise information about what data you're collecting, how you're using it, and for what purpose.
Okay, so no shady data practices. Be honest and open with users about how their data is being used.
Exactly. And always prioritize user privacy and security.
Mhm.
Implement appropriate security measures to protect sensitive information. Think about things like data encryption, using secure authentication protocols, and doing regular security audits.
So build a fortress around that user data. Make sure it's staying safe and confidential.
I love that analogy. And ultimately, remember that building trust with your users is paramount. When you're transparent, when you're responsible with their data, they're going to be much more likely to actually use your application and to trust you with their information.
Okay, be transparent, prioritize security, and build trust.
Got it. This has been so insightful. I feel like I've learned so much about GPT actions, from all the technical details to those broader ethical considerations.
It's been my pleasure to walk you through it. Remember, that OpenAI documentation, it's an invaluable resource. Take your time, explore the concepts, and don't be afraid to experiment. And if you ever get stuck, remember the OpenAI Developer Forum. It's a fantastic place to connect with other developers, ask questions, and get help. I love that. Experiment, explore, and connect with the community. All right, well, that concludes part 1 of our deep dive into the OpenAI documentation for GPT actions. We've covered a ton of information, but there's still so much more to explore.
Definitely. So stay tuned for part 2, where we're going to be diving deeper into building GPT actions. We'll talk about structuring your code, handling errors, and debugging, all that good stuff.
Until next time, keep learning, keep building, and keep pushing the boundaries of what's possible with GPT actions.
Welcome back. I hope that first deep dive into GPT actions, I hope it left you feeling empowered, not overwhelmed. So now let's roll up our sleeves and actually get into some real world application building.
Okay, yeah, I'm feeling much more confident about tackling those OpenAI docs. But
Yeah.
now I'm curious, what does the actual process of building a GPT action look like? Like, where do I even start?
That's a great question. And the OpenAI docs, they do provide a really clear structure for defining your actions, but it can be helpful to kind of break it down even further, right? Think about it like writing a recipe. You need to gather your ingredients, follow the steps, and then add your own personal touch.
I like the recipe analogy. So what are the key ingredients that I need to create a GPT action?
So the first ingredient is the name of your action, and this is basically a unique identifier that helps ChatGPT actually recognize and execute your action. You want to choose a name that's descriptive, something that clearly reflects what your action does. So something like, get a doll list or create calendar event.
Okay, so the name is like the title of my recipe. What's next?
So next up, you have the description, right?
Hmm.
And this is where you provide a concise and informative overview of what your action actually does. Think of it like the little summary on a recipe card, right? You just want to give someone a quick understanding of what to expect.
Okay, so a clear description is important. But what about the actual code that powers my action? Where does that go?
So that's where the run function comes in. This is like the heart of your GPT action. It's where you write the Python code that defines how your action actually behaves. It's like the step-by-step instructions in your recipe, right? You're telling ChatGPT exactly what to do.
Okay, so the run function is where I put my Python skills to work. Can you maybe give me a quick example of what this might look like? Just something super basic just to kind of illustrate the concept.
Yeah, sure. So let's say you're building that to-do list action that we've been talking about, right? Within the run function, you would write Python code that would interact with your to-do list data. Maybe you'd use the requests library to send HTTP requests to your to-do list API, or you might interact directly with the database using a library like Squalchemy.
Okay, so I can use any of the Python tools and libraries that I've learned to access and manipulate data within my GPT action.
Exactly. You have so much flexibility in how you actually implement that functionality.
Yeah.
But just remember those best practices that we were talking about earlier, right? Keep your code clean, well documented, and really focus on the core functionality of your action.
Right. Don't overcomplicate things or try to predict every possible edge case. Stick to the recipe and let ChatGPT handle those nuances of the user interaction.
I like it. Okay, so there are a few more ingredients that can help enhance your GPT action. Provide ChatGPT with more context. And those are parameters, tools, and returns.
Okay, let's break those down. What are parameters?
So parameters, you can think of those as like the input values for your recipe, right?
Hmm.
So they allow you to pass specific information to your GPT action, which makes it way more dynamic, more adaptable. So for example, your to-do list action might have a parameter called task that lets the user actually specify what they want to add to their list.
So parameters let me kind of customize the behavior of my action based on user input. Makes sense. What about tools? Those sound really interesting.
Yeah, so tools are a really powerful feature that allows you to extend what your GBT action can do by integrating with external APIs or services. So it's like having access to all these specialized kitchen gadgets to help you prepare your dish, right?
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give me an example of how I might use a tool in a GPT action?
Yeah, sure. So let's say you're building an action that helps users find information about movies. You could actually create a tool that uses the OMDB API, the Open Movie Database. And you could use that to fetch all sorts of movie details like the title, the director, the cast, the plot summary.
So instead of hard coding all that movie information into my action, I can use a tool to dynamically go out and grab it from an external source.
That's exactly right. And tools allow you to create these actions that are much more modular, much more scalable, because you're leveraging the power of these existing APIs and services.
Okay, tools are definitely going on my list of things to explore further. What about returns? What are those all about?
So returns are basically the output of your action. It's like the finished dish that you're serving up. So they allow you to send data back to ChatGPT, which can then be used to craft a response to the user or even trigger other actions.
So returns are how I communicate the results of my action back to ChatGPT. What kinds of data can I return?
You can return various types of data. You can return text. You can return numbers, Booleans. You can even return more complex objects. And remember that whole discussion that we had about returning raw data instead of like pre-formatted responses. So that applies here as
All
well.
right, give ChatGPT the ingredients and let it handle the presentation.
Exactly. By structuring your returns correctly, you're making sure that ChatGPT has everything it needs to provide really helpful and informative responses to the user.
This is all starting to come together. I feel like I'm really getting a good grasp on the building blocks of a GPT action. But building is only the first step, right? Hmm. What about testing and debugging? How do we make sure that our actions are actually working correctly?
Yeah, that's a super crucial part of any development process, right? Testing and debugging are essential. You need to make sure that your actions are working as expected, that they can handle all these different scenarios gracefully. And luckily, the OpenAI docs, they provide some guidance on this as well.
Okay, so what are some common strategies for testing GPT actions?
One really common approach is to use unit tests. So these are small, isolated tests that focus on very specific functions or modules within your code. By breaking down your code into these testable units, you can isolate potential issues and make sure that each part is working as expected.
So unit tests help me catch errors early on before they turn into these big, huge problems.
Exactly. Another really important thing to do is to think about different edge cases and error scenarios, right? So what happens if the user provides some invalid input, or what happens if an external API call fails? By thinking about these scenarios ahead of time and writing tests to handle them, you can build actions that are much more robust, much more reliable.
Right, so make sure my action can handle those unexpected situations and gracefully recover from any errors that might pop up.
Yeah.
What about debugging? What happens if something goes wrong and I need to figure out why?
Yeah, so debugging can be a little more challenging with GPT actions just because you're working with both your own code and then the interaction with ChatGPT. But there are still a bunch of tools and techniques that can help. So one approach is to just use logging statements within your code. And by strategically placing these log messages, you can actually track the flow of execution and figure out where potential problem areas might be.
So logging is kind of like leaving breadcrumbs throughout my code so I can follow the path of execution and see what's happening at each step.
That's a great way to think about it. And then in addition to that, you can also use the debugging tools that are provided by your Python IDE or your code editor. These tools allow you to step through your code line by line, inspect variables, and really understand what's going on inside your application at any given point.
Okay, so logging and debugging tools are my friends when it comes to troubleshooting GPT actions. Any other debugging tips?
Yeah, one more tip is to try to break down complex tasks into smaller, more manageable functions. And this not only makes your code easier to read and understand and easier to test, but it also makes debugging way easier. By isolating potential issues within smaller functions, you can pinpoint those bugs and fix them much faster.
Right. Modular code is always easier to debug. So we've talked about building, testing, and debugging GPT actions. Anything else we should cover before we wrap up this part of our deep dive?
Yeah, just one final point, but it's super important. Documentation. So documenting your actions, it's critical for you and for anyone else who might work with your code in the future. Clear, concise documentation makes your code so much easier to understand, to maintain, and to extend.
Okay, documentation is important, but sometimes it honestly feels like a chore. Any tips for making it less painful?
Yeah, absolutely. Treat documentation as like an integral part of your development process, not just something you do at the end. As you're writing your code, just add comments to explain what each section does, what inputs it expects, what outputs it produces. You can also use tools like docstrings to automatically generate documentation from your code.
So write comments as I go. Explore tools that can help automate the process. Solid advice. I feel so much more prepared to start building my own GPT actions now. I mean, we've covered so much in this deep dive. Production considerations, authentication, the open API specification, and now this whole building, testing, debugging process.
You've been a fantastic student. And just remember, the key is to approach the OpenAI documentation with confidence, not confusion, right? Just take it one step at a time, experiment, don't be afraid to ask questions, ask for help along the way. You've got this.
Well said. This deep dive has been so valuable. I can't wait to see what kinds of incredible actions I can create with all this new knowledge.
I'm excited for you. So in part 3, we'll dive into some even more advanced concepts, some best practices that'll really help you take your actions to the next level.
I'm already looking forward to it.
Yep.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep building amazing things. All right, welcome back to the final part of our deep dive into OpenAI's documentation for GPT actions. We've covered a lot of ground, from those fundamental concepts to actually building, testing, and debugging those actions. But before we wrap up, I kind of wanted to pick your brain about something.
Yeah, absolutely. Happy to share any insights I can. Fire away.
So we've talked a ton about those technical details, but what's really exciting to me is the potential of all this, right? Keep thinking about all these amazing applications that people are going to build, connecting ChatGPT to the real world in such powerful ways.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's super exciting, right? It's kind of a paradigm shift. It's changing how we're interacting with technology. It's blurring that line between conversation and action.
Yeah, exactly. It's like you're having a conversation with a computer that can actually understand you and respond in a meaningful way. So what are some of the applications you're most excited about? What do you really see developers building with GPT actions?
So one area that I think is really interesting is personalized learning and education. Imagine a GPT action that can tailor educational content to a student's individual needs, providing customized explanations, practice problems, feedback. It could really change the way we learn, make education more engaging and accessible, and just way more effective.
That's a really cool idea. It's like having a personal tutor who's always available and can adapt to your specific learning style. What else? What other applications are you thinking about?
Another area with huge potential is healthcare. You can imagine GPT actions that can help patients manage their health, schedule appointments, track medications, even provide basic medical advice, right? Based on their symptoms.
That would be huge for people who maybe have difficulty accessing healthcare or need extra support managing their health conditions. It's like having a personal health advocate right there in your pocket.
Exactly. And then think about the possibilities in other fields like finance, travel, entertainment. You could have GPT actions that help you manage your finances, plan trips, discover new music, new movies, all through these really natural conversational interactions.
It's like the world becomes our oyster and we can access all this information, all these services so effortlessly just through the power of language.
Yeah, exactly. And I think for developers, this is a huge opportunity. GPT actions, I mean, it's a chance to build really innovative and impactful applications. And by combining ChatGPT's language capabilities with their own creativity and expertise, there's really no limit to what developers can create.
I am so inspired right now. This deep dive, it's not only given me like a solid understanding of those OpenAI docs,
Yeah.
but it's really got my wheels turning about the future of GPT actions.
Well, I'm happy to hear that. And, the best way to learn is by doing. So don't be afraid to experiment, play around with different ideas, see where your creativity takes you.
Absolutely. Experimentation and exploration are key. And to all of our listeners out there, dive into those OpenAI docs, embrace those possibilities, and build the future that you want to see.
That's it for this deep dive into OpenAI's documentation for GPT actions. We hope you've enjoyed it, and we hope you feel ready to go out and build some amazing applications.
And until next time, keep learning, keep building, and keep pushing those boundaries of what's possible with AI. All right, so Python adventurers, today we are going to dive headfirst into that world of OpenAI documentation. For some people, it can feel a little intimidating, so especially if you have, like 3 months of Python experience under your belt. You might be feeling a little overwhelmed by it all.
Yeah.
But trust me, this deep dive is going to equip you with all the tools and knowledge that you need to tackle these docs like a pro.
Yeah, that's right. What we're going to do is we're going to build a clear mental roadmap together. So you're not just like reading lines of code, but you're actually understanding like the whole AI landscape, right?
Exactly. And one of the coolest things, right, that you can do with these APIs with OpenAI is you can actually teach your GPTs to become like super-powered research assistants, right?
Right. Right.
Using what they call GPT actions.
Yeah.
So imagine if you could just tell your GPT, like, hey, go find me the latest research on whatever, right? And it just does it.
Yeah.
That's the power of these GPT actions.
It's pretty remarkable what you can do with them. Essentially, what GPT actions are doing is they are letting your GPTs talk to external systems, external databases. And in that way, they can just pull information directly for you, exactly the information that you need.
So let's break down how they actually access all of that information.
Yeah.
Our source material here, it mentions three main ways that they access all this info. APIs, relational databases,
Yeah.
and vector databases.
Yeah.
To me, like I'm most familiar with APIs, but maybe you can kind of unpack that a little bit, especially for our listeners who are just starting out.
Yeah, so APIs are basically like messengers, right? They let different software systems talk to each other. So as a really simple example, think about when you log into a website and it gives you the option to log in with your Google account, for instance.
Right.
That seamless connection happens thanks to an API.
Oh, okay, that makes a lot of sense. So basically for these GPT actions, APIs are the way that they can actually go and fetch data from all sorts of other places, right?
That's right.
But how do we tell the GPT what to look for using these APIs?
Right, so there are two main commands that we can use to instruct the GPT on how to use an API. The first one is search, which is kind of like when you're on Google and you just type in a few keywords.
Right.
You're not looking for something specific, you're just casting a really wide net. And then the other option is get, which is more like when you have a specific thing in mind and you click on, the specific Google search result that you want.
Oh.
And so in that way, you're able to actually zero in on exactly what you need.
So it's kind of like having this like super organized librarian at your beck and call who can bring you precisely the book that you need.
Exactly. You give them the instructions and they know exactly where to go in the library to get you what you need.
Amazing. So to actually make all of that work, like what do we need to know?
So there are a couple of things. First of all, you need authentication, which is kind of just like a password to access a website, right?
Right.
It's making sure that only the people who are supposed to access the data are able to access the data. And then the other key concept is an open API specification. And this is basically just a blueprint that explains how the API operates.
Oh.
So what types of requests it can handle, what kind of data it can send back to you, etc.
So it's like you're teaching the GPT to like understand the rules of the library, right?
Exactly.
Speak its language.
Speak its language so it knows how to make the requests.
Okay, let's move on to relational databases.
Yeah.
I hear this term like thrown around a lot.
Uh-huh.
What are they in the simplest terms?
So in the simplest terms, you can imagine like a giant spreadsheet with rows and columns.
Okay.
That's basically what a relational database is. And companies will use these to store a ton of information. Things like customer data, their orders, really anything you can think of.
Oh, wow. So it's like a potential gold mine for GPT, right?
It is.
But I'm guessing it's not just as simple as plugging it in.
It's unfortunately not that simple. Relational databases can be a lot trickier than APIs to work with for a few reasons.
Okay.
First of all, a lot of them don't actually have those nice user-friendly APIs that make them so easy to connect to.
Okay.
Second of all, they're often very locked down for security reasons. You don't want just anyone being able to access sensitive data, right?
Right.
And then third, a lot of times the way that you query a relational database is by using a language called SQL, which is, again, something that's not super easy for a GPT to understand without a little bit of help.
So it sounds like we need like a translator to bridge that gap.
Yes, exactly. And that's where this concept of middleware comes in.
Okay.
Middleware is basically like a go-between that translates these more complex queries into something that the GPT can understand. And in that way, it basically facilitates the communication between the GPT and the database.
Oh, I see. So it's like having a diplomat, right, who's ensuring smooth communication between two very different worlds.
Right, exactly.
What about security, right?
Yeah.
Because now if the GPT is potentially accessing like sensitive data, that has to be a concern, right?
Absolutely. Database permissions are like super critical here. So one thing that you can do is you can set it up so that the GPT only has read-only access to the database.
Okay.
And what that means is that it's allowed to look at the data, but it's not allowed to modify it or delete it.
Gotcha.
So it's almost like you're giving your GPT a library card that lets it browse the books, but it doesn't let it like check anything out or rearrange the shelves, right?
That's smart.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've covered APIs, we've covered relational databases. Let's move on to these vector databases. They sound kind of intriguing. What makes them stand out?
Yeah, so vector databases are really all about understanding the meaning of the text, not just matching keywords.
Okay.
So they use something called semantic search, and what that allows them to do is to actually grasp the concepts and the relationships behind the words.
So if I were to like search for best sci-fi movies, it's not just looking for those exact words. It's actually understanding that I'm looking for films in the science fiction genre. Maybe it's considering like themes or critical acclaim or...
Exactly. It's like having a search engine that can actually read between the lines, right?
Yes.
It understands what you actually mean, not just what you typed in.
That's really impressive.
Yeah.
So what do we actually need to know to work with these vector databases?
So just like with APIs, the first thing that you need to do is make sure that your vector database has an API that's accessible, right?
Okay.
And then the other key thing is that you need to convert your text queries into what's called an embedding. And basically an embedding is like a numerical representation of a word and its meaning. It's like translating your query into the language of the vector database.
Oh, okay. So it's almost like you're giving the GPT this dictionary to translate between our human language and the vector database language.
Exactly. And then, of course, security is just as important here as it is with relational databases, right?
Yeah.
We need to be really careful about thinking about database permissions. Because vector databases are actually storing chunks of text, you really want to make sure that you're not giving the GPT access to information that it shouldn't have access to.
Right. You wouldn't want just anyone who has access to the GPT to also be able to like see all of the data that's within that vector database.
Exactly.
So is there a way to kind of like streamline this whole process of working with these vector databases? They sound pretty complex.
Yeah, middleware comes in handy here as well. So basically, in the context of vector databases, middleware acts as this bridge between the GPT and the database.
Okay.
So it does two main things. One is it provides access to the vector database through an API. And the second thing that it does is it handles that whole process of converting your plain text queries into those vector embeddings that we talked about.
Oh, wow. So it's like having a dedicated translator, right? Who can not only like speak both languages, but also make sure that like the right people have access to the right information.
Exactly. And so that actually wraps up our overview of like the three main ways that GPT actions can access data.
Fantastic. We've covered a lot of ground here. We talked about APIs. We talked about relational and vector databases. We even touched on like middleware and some of these security considerations.
Yeah, for sure.
It's really impressive.
It is. And I think it really sets the stage for, how GPTs can interact with the external world.
Right.
And really become a lot more powerful in that way. As we've been talking, I keep thinking about like the possibilities that all of this opens up, right?
Yeah.
Like we're talking about GPTs that can just like pull information from, all corners of the digital world.
Right.
They really become like, these huge knowledge powerhouses.
Like we're giving them the keys to the internet and just saying, go explore.
Exactly. And what's really cool is that like OpenAI has done a really great job of making all of this very accessible, right?
Yeah.
Like even if you are a relative beginner, the documentation is surprisingly approachable.
I'll admit, like when I first kind of dipped my toes in the world of AI, I was pretty intimidated by all the jargon, honestly.
Yeah.
But I do think that the OpenAI docs do a really good job at breaking things down in a way that just makes sense, even if you're not like a super seasoned developer.
I think they've struck a really nice balance between like the technical depth and also just the clarity.
Right.
You get the information you need without feeling completely overwhelmed. Like, remember those embeddings we talked about earlier?
Yeah.
Like that concept, when you first hear it, it sounds super complex, but the way they explain it in the documentation, it just like clicks,
Yeah, that was like a total light bulb moment for me. It was like, oh, it's not just a bunch of numbers. It's like a way for the GPT to actually understand the nuance of like human language.
Totally.
It's like they're learning to like read between the lines, not just scan for keywords.
Yeah, and I think that really highlights how AI is moving beyond just these like rule-based systems,
Yeah.
We're actually teaching these GPTs to think more like humans.
Right.
Understand context, understand meaning, It's pretty cool.
It's mind-blowing. So for our listeners out there who are, super eager to dive into the OpenAI documentation themselves, what sections would you recommend that they really focus on to understand these GPT actions and data retrieval stuff?
Yeah, so I would say a really great place to start is the section that's literally called Data Retrieval with GPT Actions.
Okay.
And that section really just gives a really good overview of everything that we've talked about today. It has like practical examples so you can see like how the different concepts actually work in practice.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah, so I would say like think of that as your cheat sheet for understanding the different ways that GPTs can access and use information.
Perfect. And what if our listeners are particularly interested in these vector databases, right? And how to make those connections really smooth? What would you suggest there?
I would definitely check out the section on middleware for vector databases.
Okay.
That section, it goes really deep into like how middleware can actually simplify that whole process
Right.
of connecting your GPT to a vector database. It has a lot of like tips and tricks for making sure that those two systems, they play nicely together.
Right, right. That's great advice. And, don't forget about the OpenAI community,
Oh,
right?
yeah.
I mean, it's a huge resource. It's like having this global support network of AI enthusiasts, right?
Exactly.
Who are always happy to, help out.
Definitely. I mean, don't be afraid to ask questions. Don't be afraid to like share your experiences, learn from other people who are kind of on the same journey. There's so much like collective knowledge and enthusiasm out there. It's all accessible.
Speaking of journeys, learning AI, it really is like a marathon, not a sprint.
You got it. Even like seasoned developers, are constantly learning and adapting as this field evolves.
Right?
The key is just to like stay curious,
Yeah.
embrace those challenges as opportunities for growth,
Right.
and never stop exploring. And, the OpenAI documentation is kind of your companion on that journey.
Yeah.
It's going to offer you that guidance and that support as you navigate this crazy world.
I love that perspective. It's not about reaching a finish line. It's like this contiguous process of discovery and innovation, right?
Totally.
And with all these resources at our fingertips, we can all kind of contribute to shaping the future of AI.
We can.
That's exciting. It's funny, as we've been talking, I keep thinking about how this documentation is kind of like a choose-your-own-adventure.
Yeah.
For building with AI, you get to decide, okay, what tools do I want to use?
Right.
What techniques am I interested in exploring? And you can kind of shape your own path, right?
It's true. The documentation really empowers you to be like the architect of your own AI experience. You get to decide which data sources you want to tap into, what problems you want to solve, and ultimately, what kind of amazing applications you want to build.
And just like a good adventure, it comes with challenges and rewards, right?
Yeah.
I mean, let's be real. Working with AI, it isn't always a walk in the park.
Oh, for sure. You're going to hit roadblocks. You're going to get unexpected errors.
Yeah.
You might even question your sanity a few times.
Right.
But that's all part of the process, right? Those challenges, they're actually opportunities to level up your skills, become a more creative developer, a more resilient developer.
I think that's such a good point, right? Embracing those moments of frustration as stepping stones.
Yeah.
And remember, you don't have to go it alone, right?
Right.
You have this huge open AI community, a global team of AI enthusiasts who are ready to, lend a helping hand or just offer encouragement.
It's one of the best things about this field is just that collaborative spirit. People are genuinely excited to share what they know and to help other people succeed.
Okay, so as we kind of wrap up our deep dive into the OpenAI documentation, what are some key takeaways for our listeners?
Well, first and foremost, I would just say remember that this documentation is your guide, It's your guide to navigating this really exciting world of GPTs and AI development. It's like a roadmap to understanding those core concepts, the tools and techniques that will let you create something really innovative.
Right. And don't let all those technical terms intimidate you. The OpenAI documentation is surprisingly approachable. They really do break down complex ideas into clear explanations, practical examples,
Right.
Helpful resources. So even if you are just starting out, you can really follow along and start building.
Exactly. Embrace the journey. Like we said before, it's a marathon, not a sprint. Stay curious, keep experimenting, and never be afraid to ask questions.
And most importantly, have fun with it.
Building with AI is so rewarding. It's all about pushing the boundaries of what's possible and creating something that might just change the world.
That's right. We can't wait to see what you build.
Until next time, happy coding.